Hello everyone. Welcome to another part of this story. Don't forget to like, sub, and share the video. This amazing story was written by Droseralex. Please support them. Now let's jump in. The night dragged onward. The forest beyond the rocky barrier breathed and shifted, a dark ocean of unseen things, whispering just at the edge of hearing. Ainz stood silently near a large, weathered boulder, stationed like a sentinel. He watched the narrow opening between the towering stones he had raised around the camp. There, in the distance, the campfire flickered, shrinking slightly, burning lower as the hours wore on. Soon it would be little more than coals and dying smoke. He remained unmoving, cloaked in heavy silence. His eyes shifted briefly back to the tree-line, wary, untrusting, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of a threat that might dare to breach his defenses. But the forest kept its secrets well. Not a breath of hostility stirred in the darkness. No ripple of mana, no flicker of intent. Only stillness, oppressive and watchful. Even so, he did not relax. He remained motionless beside the weathered boulder, eyes glowing faintly, absorbing every sound, every shift in the wind. Minutes passed, long and slow, broken only by the occasional crackle of the campfire as it withered further, shrinking into low, flickering embers. Silence stretched, thick and absolute. The kind of silence that pressed against the ears like weight. The kind of silence that made lesser men speak just to hear their own voices. But Ainz did not speak. He waited. And then, he sensed it. A faint disturbance. So small it barely qualified as sound. Small steps, uneven and unsteady, carrying almost no weight. The slight shifts in pressure, the tiny pauses of uncertainty between each step. Ainz's senses mapped them instinctively, tracing the slow, careful approach of something small, something fragile. He turned his head, slow and deliberate. A small figure crept from between the stones, frail, tentative, but driven by stubborn purpose. The boy was painfully thin. His short, dark hair clung in messy tangles to a sunken face. Deep shadows pooled beneath hazel eyes that glowed with startling life despite the weakness of the body that housed them. Ainz recognized him immediately. The boy who had picked up a sword far too large for him. Who had stood, arms quivering under the weapon's weight, between the monsters and his mother and sister, legs shaking but unyielding. A flicker of something ancient and painful stirred in Ainz's hollow chest. The boy paused when Ainz's gaze found him, fear flickering across his narrow, suntanned face. Still, the boy didn't run. Ainz moved with an exaggerated slowness, easing himself into a kneeling posture, robes spreading around him like a soft lake of black. He lowered his height until he was fairly close to eye level with the child. The boy took another trembling step closer. "Good evening," Ainz said warmly, his voice sonorous but softened, almost grandfatherly. "You are brave to approach me." The boy fidgeted, his eyes darting toward the others, sleeping forms nestled around the fire, and then back to Ainz. "What's your name, young one?" The boy hesitated. Then, voice barely a whisper. "Rain." Ainz inclined his head in a slow, regal nod. "Rain," he repeated, letting the name settle into the night air like a blessing. "A strong name. One fitting for someone as courageous as you." Rain flushed, looking down and kicking at a loose stone. "Mama said it means pure," he mumbled. "Because I was born sick." Rain hugged himself a little tighter, eyes lowered. "The healers said, I won't live long." He said it simply, like he was commenting on the weather. No drama, no fear, just a quiet truth he'd carried too long. "Mama cries when she thinks I'm asleep," he added, voice dropping to a whisper. "But I don't mind dying anymore. I'm not scared." He glanced down at his bare feet, toes curling into the dirt. "Mama, she prayed a lot. So did the priests. The healers too. I heard them when they thought I was dreaming. I know death is close," Rain whispered after a moment. His hazel eyes gleamed under the dim starlight. "But I want to protect Mama. And my sister. Her name's Lise." The weight of it hit Ainz like a hammer against brittle glass. He let out a low, thoughtful hum, trying, struggling, to find words. He shifted slightly, sitting back more fully on one knee, the firelight catching faintly across the bare ivory of his skeletal hand. Rain's words lingered in the air, quiet, heavy, brave in a way that no child should have to be. The boy had spoken of death as calmly as others spoke of dreams, as if he had already accepted it as his end. Too calmly, far too calmly for a child. Ainz studied him in silence. The small voice, the sunken cheeks, the brave, hollow words. Then, slowly, he made a decision. Not out of strategy, not for advantage, but because the weight in Rain's voice was too heavy for someone so young. If the boy had already made peace with death, then perhaps, just for a little while, Ainz could offer him something else. A moment of distraction, a flicker of wonder. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice with a conspiratorial tone, a softness few had ever heard from him. Rain, would you like to see something special? The boy blinked, startled, then his face lit up with curiosity. He nodded furiously, the earlier sadness momentarily displaced by wonder. Ainz said nothing this time. He merely raised one skeletal hand, fingers poised in stillness, and cast dancing lights. A faint shimmer spread through the air like ripples across a still pond. Then, slowly, for small orbs of pale, radiant blue blinked into existence above the boy's head. Not harsh or glaring, but soft, like moonlight reflected off a calm sea. They hovered gently in the air, drifting and circling one another with elegant grace, as if carried by some unseen breeze. Each orb pulsed faintly, shedding a cool, bluish glow that cast delicate shadows along the stone floor. They moved with a dancer's rhythm, slow, measured, hypnotic, gliding in spirals and loops like tiny stars weaving a lullaby. Rain's mouth parted slightly in wonder. He reached out one trembling hand, and as his fingers brushed near one of the orbs, it responded, dipping slightly, twirling close. He let out a soft gasp. They feel warm, he whispered, like bathwater. Or, when Mama wraps me in a blanket after washing my hair. The lights continued to drift, drifting close enough to gently illuminate Rain's tired features, bathing him in quiet color. Then, with a slow, deliberate flick of his hand, Ainz conjured a small, ornate chair beside him. It appeared in a soft shimmer of light, its legs forming from braided threads of magic that shaped into polished, dark wood. The cushion was plush velvet, deep crimson trimmed with gold, regal and oddly comforting in its presence. Rain's jaw dropped. Whoa! A proper seat for a brave knight, Ainz said with a slight smile in his voice. Rain stared at Ainz, at the black robes, the jagged bone pauldrons, the halo of darkness that hung about him like mist. But in his gaze, fear was slowly losing to something stronger. Wonder. Rain scrambled up into the chair, his legs swinging above the ground, and looked around proudly, as if surveying a kingdom that had just been gifted to him. He turned back to Ainz, grinning wide, his eyes still lit with wonder. You're not as scary as you look, he declared. Ainz paused, something small and old stirring inside him. A memory he could not fully grasp. Thank you, Rain. Your words honor me. They sat there, side by side, facing the dark forest beyond. Rain turned his head again, his gaze drawn upward. The blue orbs still drifted overhead, slower now, their glow softening, fading gently at the edges. One by one, like sleepy stars, they began to dim and disappear. Rain watched them with quiet eyes, the smile on his face turning wistful. He didn't speak. He just watched, as if committing the moment to memory, holding on to the last of the light before the night closed in. Rain then hugged his knees to his chest. You're watching for the monsters, aren't you? He asked after a moment. Ainz nodded once, the faint gleam of his eyes flickering like twin stars. Yes, I will watch until the sun returns. Not a single monster shall pass. Rain shivered, but not from cold. His thoughts darkened. The guard who died. He tried to protect us too. Ainz closed his eyes, or would have, if he still possessed eyelids. Instead, the glow behind his sockets dimmed slightly, retreating inward. Yes, that man's death had been brutal. A noble act, and a tragic loss. But in its wake, an opening. Ainz did not flinch from the thought. It was unfortunate, but necessary. Without that sacrifice, there would have been no space for him to act. No moment of desperation for him to answer. The guard's death had softened the fear in their hearts, replaced it with uncertainty, confusion, the raw silence that follows sudden violence. And into that silence, Ainz had stepped. A being born of dread, yes, but offering safety. It was only through that loss that these people could look upon him, and not see only a monster. They saw protection in place of absence. power in place of helplessness. And in that brief window, something fragile had taken root. Trust. He hated that it had come at the cost of a life. But perhaps, grim as the thought was, in this world, bloodshed was valued enough to buy trust. He couldn't be certain, but it felt that way. And if that was true, then stepping forward only after someone had fallen might be the only way a creature like him could ever be accepted. Rain's voice broke the stillness again. Mr. Ainz. Ainz turned toward him with a fluid, regal motion. Rain stared for a moment, eyes flicking across the long black robe, the skeletal hands, the glowing eyes. Is that a costume? He asked hesitantly. Are you dressed like that to scare the monsters? Ainz blinked, a flicker of red light deep in his sockets, then chuckled, a dry, papery sound. No, Rain. This is me. The boy stared harder, his face scrunched up in deep, serious thought. But you're all bones. Ainz nodded solemnly. I am. My true form is that of a skeleton. Rain's eyes widened, round as coins. Does it hurt? The question was so sincere, so immediate, that Ainz paused. He shook his head slowly. No, there is no pain. Not anymore. A brief hesitation. I do not feel things as I once did. Rain frowned thoughtfully, his skinny arms hugging his chest. Were you always like this? Ainz's gaze softened. He rested one hand lightly atop his knee, voice dropping almost to a whisper. No. Once, I was as you are, flesh, blood, life. But time and powerful magic changed me. It was a soft lie, or at least a version dulled for gentle ears. Ainz felt a flicker of guilt, but how could he explain his story in a way that a child would understand? The boy's face twisted in sympathy, not horror, not disgust. Just pure, childlike sadness. I'm sorry, he murmured, his chin resting on top of his knees, voice barely more than a breath. One of his small hands gripped the fabric of his sleeve tightly, twisting it without thinking. I didn't mean to make you sad. Ainz was taken aback by how deeply the moment reached him. You have nothing to be sorry for, Rain, he said with a small inclination of his head. I am not sad. I chose this path of my own choice. Rain looked up at him, eyes still sunken from illness, but brighter now. His expression then shifted, as if something had loosened behind his ribs. Not quite peace, but comfort. Then, shyly, he raised a hand. Can I ask you some questions? Ainz paused, then inclined his skull slightly, a slow, deliberate nod. But a faint chill ran through him all the same. There it was, that gleam in Rain's eyes. Inquisitiveness, unfiltered and dangerous, not in power, but in sheer randomness. He braced himself. Rain shifted slightly in the conjured chair, his limbs thin and slow, then looked up at Ainz, blinking with overwhelming curiosity. Can you still sneeze? Ainz let out a low chuckle, deep, hollow, and dry, like wind through old stone. I lack a nose, mucous membranes, and any reaction to allergens. So no. Rain snorted. Lucky. Ainz agreed. It is a small mercy. Also, Rain tilted his head, studying him closely. You don't blink. Ainz made a soft sound, somewhere between amusement and reflection, and slowly raised one bony hand to rest beneath his jaw, skeletal fingers tapping once against the edge of his mandible in mock contemplation. That's true, he said, his voice low and composed. I suppose I no longer have the parts for that. Oh, Rain nodded solemnly, as if absorbing a great truth. He tapped one finger lightly against his chin, brows furrowing in exaggerated thought. Ainz remained still, watching him with quiet patience, the way one might observe a strange, delicate bird. There was a pause. Then, can you eat? Rain asked suddenly, his voice curious but hesitant, as though unsure if it was rude. Ainz canted his head a fraction, the crimson light behind his eyes softening as if in quiet reflection. I can't eat, he said at last, his baritone voice smooth but distant. He paused, fingers folding lightly at his chest in a gesture of faint reminiscence. I remember what it was like. The taste, the texture, but I no longer need food. Nor water. Nor sleep. He said it without bitterness, yet the weight in his voice lingered like a shadow, the quiet cost of immortality worn with reluctant pride. Rain's eyes widened with awe at first. That's kinda cool, he said, his voice small but sincere. But then his expression shifted. The sparkle faded. He hugged his knees a little tighter, his gaze drifting downward. But it also sounds really lonely. Ainz felt something twist deep inside him. Not pain exactly, but something close. A buried echo. A faint ripple in the hollow where a heart once beat. He regarded the boy in silence for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said quietly. It can be. A brief, heavy silence. Then Rain brightened. But you're not alone right now, he said proudly. He scrambled upright, standing on the seat for extra height, then planted himself firmly beside Ainz's knee, puffing out his chest like a tiny knight preparing to defend his kingdom. Ainz stared at him for a long moment, the flicker of light behind his socket softening. You're right, Rain, he said, voice thick with something he could not name. I am not alone. The forest beyond rustled, but the stone walls kept the night at bay. After a while, Rain pulled a crushed clover from his pocket, wrinkled but clearly precious, and held it out. For you, he said, so you won't feel lonely. Ainz accepted it as if it were a royal crown, tucking it gently into the folds of his robe and right into the safety of his inventory. He stared at the boy for a long moment. Then, slowly, almost uncertainly, raised his hand. The gesture felt alien, forced, a memory from a life that no longer belonged to him. His sharpened fingertips hovered just above Rain's hair, as if unsure whether such a thing should be done, or could be done, by something like him. Then, with a stiffness not born of hesitation but of unfamiliarity, he lowered his hand and gave the boy a single, slow pat. Then another, and another. It was clumsy, awkward, a blessing in shape, if not in grace. You have given me a treasure beyond gold, Rain, he said softly, solemnly. The boy smiled. It was a genuine, fearless smile. They sat together, looking out toward the encroaching darkness. Rain's chin had started to drift toward his knees, his eyes blinking a little slower now, but he fought the pull of sleep, still trying to keep him company. Ainz turned to him after a moment. You know, Rain, he began, voice almost conspiratorial. I have met many men, some who wore fine armor and spoke loudly of courage. He leaned in slightly, his robes whispering over the stones. But when true danger came, they ran. Rain looked up at him, wide-eyed. Ainz chuckled, a low, dry sound, almost fatherly. Yet here you are, tiny, thin as a twig, and still you came forward. Still you worry for others before yourself. He placed a careful, skeletal hand over Rain's heart, a slow, theatrical gesture. In my eyes, you are a knight already. A true one. Rain's mouth parted in amazement, as if he hadn't even dreamed of being called such a thing. Ainz tapped his chin thoughtfully, then said, Perhaps, Sir Rain, protector of mothers and little sisters? It has a noble ring to it, does it not? The boy gave a tiny laugh, the sound bright and brittle like a bird's chirp. Emboldened, he sat up straighter in his chair. Sir Rain, he repeated under his breath, as if savoring it. Ainz nodded solemnly. I would entrust a kingdom to a boy like you, he said. Because you understand what many forget, that strength means nothing without the will to protect. Rain's face shone, lit from within. A brief, warm silence fell between them. Rain yawned as he shifted again, peeking toward the dark woods. What happens if the monsters come? Ainz's voice dropped, gaining a low, commanding resonance. No louder than before, but now carrying the cold gravity of something ancient and unshakable. Then they shall find, he said, the words deliberate, edged with steel, that they are the ones who should be afraid. Rain smiled softly. He yawned again, blinking sleepily. Ainz continued, voice softer, almost reverent. Rain, remember this. You are a life to be protected, a soul to be cherished. Your bravery, your kindness, they are precious things. The boy's lip trembled. He bit down fiercely, fighting back tears. Finally, he jumped off his chair and leaned forward, pressing his small, trembling hand against the heavy black fabric of Ainz's robe, right where a human heart would have beat. Ainz froze at the touch, feeling it ripple through the magic sustaining him. Rain's voice was a drowsy breath. I thought you were deaf, but you're warm. Ainz, moved beyond any words he could summon, reached out again, this time with slightly less hesitation, but still with care. His skeletal hand hovered over Rain's head, massive claw-like fingertips catching the firelight. It still felt unfamiliar, strange in a body that knew only silence and death. Despite the skeletal coldness of his touch, Rain smiled sleepily and leaned into it, comforted. His shoulders slumped, a long, boisterous yawn escaping him as his small body relaxed completely. His head bobbed once, then again, eyes blinking slower with each breath, the fight to stay awake already lost. When he spoke next, ainz's voice was low but firm, woven with a thread of command. "Sir Rain," he said warmly, "you must return to your mother now, before she wakes and finds you gone." The boy blinked up at him sleepily, confused for a moment. Ainz continued, softening his tone. "Go back to her side. Rest well. We shall speak again in the morning if you wish to. I promise." Rain's small face lit with a drowsy, trusting smile. He nodded, sluggishly taking a few steps. His legs wobbled, and he stumbled slightly, but he caught himself, determination carrying him forward. Ainz watched silently as Rain shuffled back across the rocky clearing, the firelight casting his tiny figure in gold and shadow. When he reached the sleeping forms by the fire, he knelt awkwardly beside his mother. She stirred, half-waking, and instinctively pulled him into her arms without a word, pressing him close against her body, shielding him protectively alongside his little sister. Rain curled into her grasp without resistance, a small, fragile thing embraced by warmth and love, the tension in his thin body finally unraveling. Within seconds, his breathing evened out, slow and soft, lost to the comforting rhythm of his family's presence. Ainz remained where he was, watching in silence, his burning eyes reflecting the faint, golden flicker of the dying fire. The camp settled into deeper stillness. The fire crackled low, casting long, trembling shadows across the stones. He turned his gaze back to the forest, cold, vast, ancient. It whispered in the dark, an endless breath of unseen things, pressing against the night. And Ainz watched it all, unmoving, tireless, a silent sentinel between fragile life and devouring dark. The night air was thick and stifling beyond the rocky barrier. The red glow in his sockets burned low, wary. His gaze swept the tree-line, slow and methodical, drinking in every whisper, every shiver of branch and leaf. The forest breathed, a vast, living entity cloaked in shadow, its countless unseen eyes watching from the black. His attention drifted back to the camp. The survivors had fallen into uneasy rest. Rain had fallen asleep long ago, curled beside his mother and sister. The others slept as well, though lightly. Bodies shifted. Hands clutched weapons even in dreams. But it was rest, nonetheless, bought not with safety, but with the illusion of it. Ainz's presence was unnatural. His very form should have only induced terror. And yet, it was his promise that had calmed them. His magic, his wall of stone, his dreadful existence. They slept not because they were unafraid, but because something even more terrifying had sworn to protect them. His gaze returned to the trees. The forest loomed like a wall of breathless giants, ancient titans murmuring amongst themselves. He could feel it, the tension in the earth, the wrongness just beyond sight. He could not detect any hostile presence, and yet, he knew they were out there. Whether lingering by instinct or under some unseen command, he could not tell, but it felt like they were watching, waiting. Ainz narrowed his eyes. He would not allow the illusion of peace to lull him into complacency. With a whisper of power, he silently cast, alert. Faint rings of glyphs, intricate and swirling, bloomed across the burnt terrain around the camp. Layer upon layer, overlapping until nearly no inch of ground beyond a few hundred feet remained untouched. Anything that crossed into the perimeter would trigger the spell. Ainz tilted his head in faint approval, though a shadow of doubt lingered. He briefly considered casting explosive landmine along the outer perimeter. A web of invisible death, a killing ground, erasing anything that set foot upon it. But a single misstep by one of the survivors would be disastrous. He could not risk it. The protective wards, the layering of alert, spells covering every inch of earth around the camp, and his own vigilant presence would suffice, right? His gaze lingered on the tree-line, unblinking. The wind shifted. No, it wouldn't. His paranoia whispered. He wove more spells into the air, paranormal intuition, and sense enemy. The glow of his eyes swirled briefly with eerie green as the magic took hold. His senses expanded, spiderwebbing into the dark. Nothing. No flicker of bloodlust. No malicious presence. Only the cold, empty woods. It unsettled him more than if he had found something. Am I being hunted? Observed? Heard it? The questions circled him like carrion birds, never landing, never leaving. Ainz's fingers curled behind his back, bone clicking softly against bone. The glow in his sockets flared, faint, but sharp. A flash of frustration. Not fear, but something close. He turned his gaze back toward the tree lean, scanning the shadows as if daring them to answer. No. Enough waiting. His voice was low, firm, not loud, but final. Inaction is a fool's comfort. He straightened slightly, spine locking into place as if anchoring his resolve. He cast silence over the camp, ensuring that anything he did beyond the barrier, any sounds of battle or magic, would not reach the ears of the sleeping survivors. Satisfied, ainz turned back towards the forest. His figure shimmered, space itself warping around him. In the blink of an eye, he was gone. No grand gesture, no raising of hands, only the quiet distortion of reality acknowledging its master's will. He reappeared deeper into the forest, far beyond the camp's protective wards, out of sight, out of reach. The darkness here was thicker, almost suffocating. The trees pressed in close, their trunks slick with moss, their roots curled like claws through the soil. The air was heavy with damp rot, rich with the stench of old leaves and unseen decay. To ainz's undead eyes, it was as clear as midday, but that clarity did little to ease his wariness. He stood still for several long moments, not moving, not speaking. His eyes swept the forest like blades, left, right, then overhead, tracing every branch, every patch of disturbed undergrowth, and any subtle anomaly in the air. No sounds of pursuit, no movement, nothing. And yet still, he waited. Only when the stillness pressed in without change, when the woods returned nothing but silence and stagnant breath, did ainz finally turn his gaze downward. With a motion barely more than a breath, he released a ribbon of shadowed power. The ground writhed beneath him, shifting like flesh beneath a blade. Even the stones recoiled from the spell's touch. He paused, his head tilting slightly, not in alarm, but in faint, clinical curiosity. The shape of a plan had only just begun to take form. A desire to protect the survivors, to fortify their notion of attempting a summon had not yet crystallized into deliberate thought. Not entirely. And yet, his body had already understood the need, already answered it. It was as if the intent had bypassed thought entirely, heard not by mind, but by marrow. The knowledge was simply there, not recalled, but revealed. A body surfaced from the writhing depths. It was one of the bandits he had slain earlier, a mage. Perfectly preserved, not yet touched by decay. ainz stared at the corpse in silence. He didn't remember taking it. No spell, no gesture, no conscious command to store the body. His brow would have furrowed if he still had one. Had it been automatic? An unconscious action? A quiet instinct in his undead form, harvesting resources without permission? The thought unsettled him more than the corpse itself. He observed the dead mage again, searching for something, a reaction, a flicker of feeling, and found only silence. A voice, ancient and rotten, then stirred in the hollow of his mind. It slithered up like smoke from beneath his awareness, an ever-present pressure, subtle but relentless. A pressure behind the eyes, a weight in the bones. Flay the soul, hollow the shell, stitch purpose into the corpse. Make it kneel, make it serve. ainz remained still. The words slithered across his thoughts like oil, cold, unwelcome, yet undeniably precise. It felt wrong, dissonant, like a song played in reverse. But it was also logical, efficient. The body would serve no one as it was. Letting it rot would be wasteful. He stared at the corpse a moment longer. The memories returned, the kidnapped woman's sobs, the bruises, the cruelty etched into her trembling form. He had done no wrong in ending such filth. The man had earned this end. He sealed his own fate, and now ainz would choose what came next. Repurpose. The word echoed, not as a command, but an enticing suggestion. It came from nowhere and everywhere. A whisper without breath, brushing the edge of thought like a ripple across still water. ainz didn't recoil from it. Instead, he listened. Not submission, not surrender. Understanding. He tapped a finger against his bony chin. I need a forward unit. he murmured, voice low and stripped of warmth. Something capable of surviving worst-case encounters. Survival and defense is paramount. Scouting is secondary. His mind ticked through possibilities, not in hesitation, but with precision. He needed something that could hold a line, terrify on sight, and crush lesser threats without advanced guidance. Something reliable, durable, brutal. The answer came quickly, obvious. Ainz did not pause to second-guess or wonder if the summoning would succeed. He simply cast the doubt aside and acted. "Let us begin, then," he said quietly. Not a command, but an invocation. His voice was low and rich, almost reverent, as though calling not upon a spell, but a doctrine. He let the presence guide his focus, like memory pulled from bone. Only instinct, as if the body remembered what the soul had forgotten. His hand rose again, skeletal fingers extended, palm facing downward, a monarch's gesture to the soil. The air thickened, heavy, dense, almost wet with unseen pressure. The wind shifted, curling inward. A chill laced the mist now coiling at his feet. "Death Knight," he said, not shouting, not proclaiming, but speaking as one who expected the world to listen. The world answered. Dark miasma surged from his palm, black and violet, writhing like living tendrils. It slithered through the air, thick and heavy, before pouring into the corpse below. The sludge clung to the dead flesh, sinking deep into skin, into bone, into marrow, like rot given purpose. The body twitched, then seized violently. A dreadful symphony followed, wet tearing, joints cracking, sinew splitting as the corpse contorted and began to swell grotesquely. From the sunken sockets of the bandit's skull, two hateful red lights blazed to life, twin coals of endless fury. His jaw unhinged in a silent scream as his body expanded, bones stretching, limbs thickening until he towered over 2 meters high. Armor burst from his flesh as if grown rather than forged, jagged plates of blackened metal that oozed into place with grotesque smoothness. Across the surface ran pulsing, red veins, sickly and cancerous, like festering roots worming through steel. They throbbed with every heartbeat the creature no longer had, glowing faintly with an inner malignance. Spikes jutted from the armor, crooked, brutal things that seemed made to maim, not protect. A thick helm grew into place with a sickening, wet crack, crowned by 2 twisted, demonic horns. Beneath it, a rotted face snarled eternally, lips split, gums peeled back in a grotesque rictus of hatred. Below the neck, its ribcage was plainly visible, blackened bone jutting through decaying muscle, barely concealed by strips of dark, tattered cloth that clung to it like the remnants of a burial shroud. In its left hand, it carried a tower shield, massive and cruelly functional, its surface scarred and dented as if it had already seen dozens of battles. In its right, it gripped a flamberge, long and rippling like flame. The blade was wreathed in a haze of black and red mist, pulsing like a living thing. Thick, oily strands of fog oozed from its edge, and the air around it throbbed with a nauseating, unclean pressure. The creature loomed, not standing, but coiled, as if every moment was a hair's breadth from violence. Each breath was a ragged snarl, every motion the promise of brutality. Ainz watched, silent and unmoving. Even for him, the thing was intimidating. "Magnificent," he eventually whispered. The Death Knight responded to the sound of his voice. It closed the distance and dropped to one knee, slamming its tower shield into the dirt with a resonant boom that echoed through the trees. It then drove the tip of its flamberge into the ground with a heavy, shuddering thud. Its aura pulsed outward in slow, sickening waves, a torrent of dark energy that buffeted against Ainz, coiling through his robes and bones, mingling with his own presence like a cold tide. How long will it last? Ainz pondered. In Yggdrasil, the duration of summoned undead had limits, time-based constraints. But this Death Knight had a corpse as its foundation, a proper vessel. Would it persist indefinitely? Until destroyed? He would have to observe, track its behavior, study its decay, if any occurred. Ainz lifted his hand slowly, not with flourish, but with finality. His voice, low and absolute, rolled through the mist like a distant drumbeat. "Stand." The Death Knight moved. Metal groaned like grinding stone as it rose, the motion slow and deliberate, less like a man rising to his feet, and more like a siege engine returning to readiness. The tower shield scraped along the earth, its edge tearing a shallow wound in the dirt before the creature hefted it with unnatural ease. The flamberge followed, serrated, pulsating, mist still curling from its edge in sluggish coils. Then it stood motionless, fully upright, waiting, silent, obedience, immediate, absolute. Ainz's mind turned. Efficient, mechanical. If the summon proved stable, perhaps more would be warranted. Options unfurled like blueprints. Resources, tactics, outcomes. His gaze flicked back toward the forest. Would higher-tier summons require more than one corpse? He could acquire them. Air had spoken of their village. Dozens of bodies, perhaps more. Not soldiers, not threats, but raw material. Enough flesh for a small legion. Bandits would suffice for now, but they were crude fuel. If he needed better quality ingredients, he could. He would. His thoughts continued, smooth and tireless. If he wanted absolute certainty, true, unshakable victory in any encounter, then he would need a proper front line. Dozens of death knights, wraiths, soul eaters, a hanzo or two for infiltration and assassination. He would need to. His mind screeched to a violent, screeching halt. The thoughts, so cold, so clear, suddenly froze in place, brittle as ice. He blinked. Once. Slowly. His body stilled. He took a step back. His hands, once half lifted in mid-calculation, dropped to his sides. The infernal glow in his eyes dimmed, then faded entirely, leaving only hollow blackness behind the sockets. What was he just thinking? There had been no hesitation in those thoughts. No regret. No emotion. No weight. Just cold, blunt arithmetic. The silence around him pressed inward, heavy and oppressive. He had planned their deaths, not in defense, not as a last resort, but as strategy, as if their lives were already gone. Something had shifted, slipped. That hadn't been him. That had been something else. Something older, darker, cruel, and patient. And just like that, the realization struck him, cold, heavy, inescapable. His voice, when it came, was quiet, flat, stripped of all warmth. Not names, not lives, just numbers. He paused. Something inside him twisted. Just corpses waiting to be used. The words clung to the air like ash. His skeletal jaw moved slowly, almost mechanically, as if forcing the truth out. I see their deaths as a resource, their bodies as raw material. He fell silent. The stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind that follows after a man realizes he's standing at the edge of something he can't come back from. He had watched the bandits die. He had torn them apart with no more regard than a child stepping on insects. He hadn't wanted to admit it before, but deep down, a part of him hadn't seen the corpses as victims of his justice, only as materials. Units to be stored, allocated, and used. His hands twitched at his sides. His bones made no sound, but his soul felt like it had cracked slightly, like glass beneath pressure. And yet, the disgust he expected never came. No spike of horror, no swelling guilt, only a dull ache, like a memory of pain echoing through numb flesh. The regret he now recognized was there. Yes, but tempered, quiet, like a murmur behind a thick door. Why does this not bother me more? His voice wasn't angry, just hollow, like someone asking where their heart had gone. His mind turned inward, dissecting, measuring. When I arrived, I felt normal, like I had just logged off of Yggdrasil. Still me. He began to pace slowly, his steps silent over trampled grass. But minutes passed, and the feelings shifted. It hadn't been sudden. It was gradual, like fog creeping up from the earth and winding around his thoughts. He first felt nostalgia, a sense of loss. But then he stumbled upon the bandits. And something switched. Apathy, action, brutality. His body had moved before he thought. His spells had come without hesitation. His judgment had been absolute and merciless. And only when the woman fled, trembling, broken, only then had he even thought to look inward. That's when he noticed it. Aura of despair was active. It had settled around him like a second skin. Unnoticed, comfortable, unresisted. As natural as a heartbeat he no longer had. He had suppressed it after that incident. Not to hide what he was, but to avoid tipping the scale. Someone might have overlooked the bones, the silence, but not the overwhelming dread. And that is the only variable. That is the only thing that has changed. Since that moment, he had begun to feel. Not fully, not vividly, but in fragments. Emotions warring in the shadows of his mind. Cold instinct, now forced to share space with hesitation, morals, doubt, guilt, and reflection. He stopped walking. When he had detected the wolf creatures earlier, he had noticed something in the air. Not mana signatures directly. Something lighter. More subtle. He focused now, sharpening his vision, mana essence layered over his eyes. His crimson gaze intensified, and then he saw it. Specks. Glowing particles, faint as stardust, suspended in the air like mist. They danced between leaves, curled against bark. The plants shimmered faintly with it. So did the stones. Ambient mana, he asked the silence, not expecting a reply, but hoping the world might whisper one anyway. It was not just magic in its most rudimentary form. It was something else. It seemed to flow, to respond. Then he saw the Death Knight. Or rather, he saw the space around the Death Knight. A void. A churning repellent field where the specks of light recoiled from its form. The particles curled away, dissolved, and fled. And, most disturbingly of all, ainz saw the same effect occurring on himself. Around his bones, his robe, the tips of his pauldrons. A slow, imperceptible peeling back, as if the world itself was trying to get away from him. So, he murmured, I am a foreign object, and this mana reacts to my negative energy as one would to poison or shadow. But it wasn't violent. It wasn't attacking. It was withdrawing. A passive rejection, like flame flickering against wet stone. He turned toward the Death Knight. Step back. The creature obeyed instantly, retreating into the tree line with pounding, metallic footsteps. The air changed. The glowing specks began to return, first slowly, then quickly, like embers caught on a breeze. They circled around him, hovered, danced. They clung to him, like static, like snow, like 1,000 invisible hands trying to connect. He felt it then. The cold in his core receded, just slightly. The whispers, the ones that urged efficiency, that silenced mercy, fell back. Not gone, but quieter, like voices behind a cracked door. He exhaled soundlessly. Fascinating. The aura drives them back. The mana flees from our magic. He tested the theory. Upon activating his aura, the effect was immediate. From his body, a wave of malevolent pressure erupted. Dark tendrils, like smoke wrapped in thorns, lashed outward from his form. They danced and snapped at the air like serpents. ainz felt the approaching mana recoil from him, as if the very world had flinched. The ambient energy was not simply repelled, it was disgusted. He could feel it now, as clearly as air on skin, the contrast. Before, the mana had embraced him. Now, it refused to touch him. The specks curled in on themselves, disintegrated, fled. The air turned sharp, hollow, empty. He stood in the center of it all, and felt nothing. The guilt was gone. The thoughts were clear. But the little bit of warmth was gone too. He canceled the aura. Silence settled again. The specks returned. Slowly, hesitantly. He glanced around slowly, his gaze drifting toward the faint, drifting motes that shimmered through the air, barely visible, like threads of light caught in a breeze. They moved with no clear source, no pattern, yet they felt aware. This mana is more than raw energy. He whispered. It may carry a residue of emotion. Is it something deeper, the living pulse of the world itself, saturating everything? His eyes narrowed, the faint red glow within them flickering as he spoke softly, more to the air than to himself, his voice low and edged with something he could not describe. And as his words faded into the quiet, something in his chest twisted, subtle, like a warm needle slipping between ribs. At first, the feeling was distant, a whisper, but it grew. Guilt began to slide in, not sharp, not immediate. A slow blade, suspended above him. It gained weight, then speed, and finally, it struck. The thought cleaved through his composure with terrible clarity. If this world's magic had no sway over me, would I have walked into that clearing as a savior, or as death itself? Would I have carved power from their corpses and felt only satisfaction? He didn't speak the answer. He didn't have to. The fact that he couldn't immediately deny it, that was the answer. And then he thought of Rain, daring brave, his genuine smile, his small voice in the night, the shriveled, brittle clover he had gifted him, sitting in his inventory. The thought hit him like a hammer to the soul, sudden, brutal, and impossible to ignore. His spine stiffened. His hands clenched. A silent jolt of something ugly, something painful, reared itself. Would I have killed him too? The thought twisted in his chest. He didn't know. He hated that he didn't know. He hated what that meant. His eyes flickered, dimming in the dark. It was not an idle question. It wasn't paranoia. It was a real possibility. He tried not to think about it. About rain. But the thought had already been planted, quietly, deeply, and it refused to die. If he had been in that other state, the cold, calculating state, where feelings were buried under thick, suffocating stillness, would he have stood there and watched rain die? Would he have thought it was strategically irrelevant? Too risky? Not worth the mana cost? His fingers twitched slightly at the thought. I need to be careful, he breathed. Barely a voice at all. More like a grim warning meant only for himself. Aura of despair was more than a deterrent here. More than fear made manifest. It changed him. It dulled the mana in the air. It severed the gentle pressure that made him feel. And without that, the decisions he made became cleaner, but colder. Crueler. I am not just dangerous to others in that state. I am dangerous to myself. The thought sickened him. If he could even feel sickness anymore. He stepped forward, voice flat, but steady. Death Knight. The creature responded immediately, emerging from the gloom with slow, stomping footfalls. The earth beneath it shivered. The mist around its blade pulsed with raw, dark energy, the weapon humming faintly with buried hatred. It stopped a few meters away, one hand clenched tightly around its flamberge, the other dragging its tower shield like a funeral gate. Its oppressive aura had condensed flat against its body. You will patrol the forest's edge, ainz said, tone unyielding, commanding. Remain hidden, silent, vigilant. If you detect any enemy presence, you will alert me immediately. You will not engage humans unless ordered. Is this understood? The Death Knight growled, a horrible, grinding noise, like stone cracking under pressure. It bowed lower, the gesture stiff and unnatural. It straightened with a lumbering motion, fog curling outward from the hilt of its blade. Even as it moved with caution, the ground seemed to protest its presence, trembling faintly beneath its mass. Ainz watched it vanish into the treeline, a shadow consumed by deeper shadow. And still, he felt the cold tether between them, the threat of absolute control. He could feel its hatred, a buried, boiling thing, suppressed only by will and command. It was a weapon, a monster, his to wield, and that power comforted him, just a little, enough to ease the sharp edge of his fear. Not completely, never completely. He exhaled, a soundless, habit-born breath, hollow and instinctive. I've done what needed to be done, he said softly, but even to his own ears, the words felt paper-thin. No pride, no satisfaction, just an echo of justification spoken into silence. Even if I say it out loud, does that make it true? His hand lowered, fingers curling slightly, as if grasping at something that wasn't there. A shimmer of magic, a ripple of air, and he vanished. He reappeared in an instant, standing once again beside the large, weathered boulder at the camp's edge. The campfire was just embers now, warm, soft, a contrast to the blackness behind him and within him. Ainz did not approach them. He did not dare to. He merely sat on the boulder, folding his robes around himself. The rock behind his spine felt old, worn, real. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke. Someone had prepared a meal, and the faint aroma still carried in the air. The camp slept. It was peaceful, because of him. And still, he felt no comfort. That is what I've become. A barrier. A weapon. A thing of dread that guards the warmth of others without ever sharing in it. He sat in silence, watching the stars in the distance. And in that silence, something settled into the hollows of his ribcage. Not pain, not even sadness, but weight. A cold, heavy awareness of what he truly was. This is what it means to be an overlord. Not in title, not in might, but in thought. In the way his mind reached for the coldest, most efficient solution. In how easily he let himself become the end of things. He had almost become something else tonight. Not evil, not good, just absent. A will without warmth. A death that chose who lived, based only on function. No love, no joy, only decisions. I can never allow that to happen again. The bonfire was little more than a bed of glowing embers now. One of the survivors stirred, murmuring softly in their sleep. The cold wind brushed the edge of his robe, a whisper, like the forest fearfully exhaling around him. He stood motionless, a sentinel of stillness and shadow. A thin coating of this world's mana permeated his body now. Maybe it would be better to leave. Once he escorted them to the village, he could vanish. Slip away, before his presence became a danger. Before that voice inside him, quiet but constant, spoke louder than his conscience. It would be safer. For all of them. For Rain. Ainz's eyes dimmed, flickering low behind hollow sockets. He thought of the boy's small hand pressed to his robe. The way he had smiled. The trust in his eyes. If I hurt him, even by mistake. He couldn't finish the thought. He simply stood there, watching the night. Watching the stars. Bright beyond relief, without global pollution, without city lights, without noise. Just the vastness above, ancient and uncaring, draped in an ocean of stars so sharp they looked like glass dust scattered across velvet. They were beautiful, painfully so. Some pulsed gently, others shimmered faintly behind drifting clouds, distant, indifferent witnesses to the world below. How many of those stars were already dead, collapsed, consumed, gone for centuries, millennia, or millions of years, yet still shining, still reaching him? The light of the dead. That was all it was. And even so, it was beautiful. He was nothing but what remained, the echo of a man. A will, a voice, and a face made of bone. And yet he still stood, still acted, still hoped, even if it was foolish. The galaxies above had outlived kings and gods. They had watched as civilizations fell, their warmth fading while the stars remained. Perhaps he too would linger like them, bright only in the memories of others. Cold, distant, hollow. He lowered his gaze at last. The wind stirred faintly again, curling around his cloak, brushing along the edge of the stone beneath his feet. He said nothing, did nothing. Only one cold truth settled inside him, heavy and cold. He should not stay. Not near them. Not near the boy. If he lost control again, if he became that empty, calculating thing, Rain would be the one to suffer. And that, more than anything, he would never forgive. The stars continued to shine above him, beautiful, distant, uncaring, dead. And ain's gown stood beneath them, silent and alone, afraid not of the dark, but of what he might become within it. The first hints of morning bled through the forest like watercolor on parchment. Ainz remained motionless atop the boulder, his robes draped over the stone like liquid shadow. The sky, once a vast sheet of obsidian, had begun to change, streaks of soft amber and deep coral stretching over the horizon like tentative fingers reaching for the day. Thin clouds caught fire with color, glowing gold and rose, drifting slowly and regal above the treeline. The forest no longer loomed. It exhaled. Dew clung to leaf and branch, glimmering like crystal dust. The air, though still cool, had lost the heavy dread of the night. Somewhere beyond the trees, birds began to stir. Tentative chirps, as if testing the silence for danger before committing to song. And ainz sat through it all, silent, still, his burning gaze half turned to the woods. Even with the ground scorched and the grass blackened from magic, even with trees near the camp charred and cracked from the heat of spells, the beauty of the forest endured. Not untouched, but unbroken. His thoughts faded slowly, giving way to stillness. A moment without calculation, without strategy. And then, in the distance, beyond the glow of dawn and the waking birdsong, ainz felt it, the tether, the hidden death knight, patrolling the deeper woods. A presence not born of nature, but force. Rage, caged and armored. Waiting, ready. Ainz did not move, but his gaze turned ever so slightly toward the death knight, and the stillness inside him began to shift. It was like a heartbeat just beyond perception. The death knight's presence simmered at the edge of his mind, not mindless, but seething. And beneath that rage was an ironclad will, bound wholly to ainz. It would obey without hesitation, fight to the death without question. Its loyalty was absolute, not born of love or duty, but of unbreakable magical command. It brooded in silence, its every breath steeped in hatred, not toward ainz, never toward ainz, but toward the world itself. The fury never faded. It simply waited, coiled beneath the surface, seeking release. And that fury, that hunger, bled toward him. Not enough to adversely affect his mind. Not truly. But he could sense it. A pressure behind the eyes. a gnawing tension in the space between thoughts. Is this what all undead feel? He wondered. Is this hatred a constant? Not directed, just present. A venom for the living. A bitterness for the world itself. As ainz pondered, it continued its patrol. A wide circle around the camp's perimeter, continuous, vigilant. If any creatures had survived the night before, they had not returned. Perhaps they had scattered. Or perhaps they were regrouping, waiting patiently for another opportunity to strike. But for now, there was only stillness. It was peaceful. Ainz's gaze lingered at the forest's edge for some time. Then, sensing the stir of life behind him, he shifted slightly on the boulder, turning just enough to be visible through the opening in the rocky barrier. Not so direct as to alarm, but clear enough that no one could accuse him of sneaking or hiding. A few figures drowsy stirred behind the stone. They did not approach. Not yet. But he saw the cautious movements, the exhausted glances. Someone nodded. Another gave a faint wave. It was more than fear this time. Courtesy, perhaps, or something trying to be it. The campfire was lit again. Not a great blaze, but enough to hold back the morning chill now that the effects of endure elements had ended. The pleasant smell of smoke and char drifted through the clearing, mingling with the earthy scent of damp bark and turned soil. A bit of meat was skewered over the fire, sizzling faintly. Then, from behind the boulders, a small face peeked out. Rain. The boy's eyes sparkled with recognition. He lifted a hand, a shy wave, more reflex than greeting. Ainz's socket flames pulsed, just faintly. A ripple of something warm. Or perhaps the echo of warmth. Whatever he still had. Then the boy vanished, yanked back by a scolding hand and muffled protest. But he's my friend. Rain's voice, though hushed, was unmistakable. Ainz didn't smile. He couldn't. But something inside him ached in a way that almost resembled happiness. He let the moment pass. The remaining gloom that had haunted the woods quickly faded, not with magic, but with sunlight. The dawn spread like balm over the earth, casting long shafts of light through the trees, painting the moss and underbrush in hues of soft green and gold. And then, slow and cautious, Aaron stepped out from the camp. He walked with the stiffness of age and caution, his frame slightly hunched beneath a thick wool cloak. In his hands, he carried 2 wooden mugs, steam curling up from their rim in lazy spirals. "Good morning, Sir Gown," he said, voice warm but faintly nervous. Ainz offered a small, measured bow of the head. "Good morning." Aaron hesitated, then held one of the mugs forward. "Some tea. I thought you might want something warm." "I am afraid I must refuse," Ainz said, his voice steeped in courtesy, touched by quiet apology. There was a faint trace of something deeper beneath the surface, perhaps a sense of loss. "This vessel, what remains of me, has no need for food or drink. It is the nature of undeath." The last words carried a slight edge, so faint it might have gone unnoticed, but Aaron caught it. A bitterness, buried under layers of composure. He nodded solemnly. "Of course. I thought as much. But," he gave a modest, self-conscious smile. It felt wrong not to offer. Ainz regarded the steaming mug for a moment longer, then gently accepted it with both hands, careful not to let it spill. He rested it in his lap with deliberate care, the faint curl of steam rising toward his unmoving face. "It is appreciated," he said quietly. "It smells delightful." Aaron stepped beside him. For a while, they said nothing, standing in companionable silence as the morning light filtered through the trees. Then, almost hesitantly, Aaron spoke again. "I can't imagine what that's like, not being able to enjoy food, or drink, or even a bit of alcohol, when the mood's right." He gave a short, quiet chuckle. "Some say it's one of life's last true pleasures. Seems a cruel trade." Ainz was still. When he finally replied, his voice was measured, regal, but softer than before. "Perhaps it is," he said, his voice calm but distant. "But those pleasures were the price of something else. Strength, yes, but also solitude, and burdens I would not have chosen, such as the shape of a curse, power granted, and much taken." He lied through his teeth, but it was necessary. The legend he wove of his past demanded such words, and there was some truth in them. Enough that he didn't feel guilty for the deception. He had gained strength. He had taken on burdens, some terrible, but he had never chosen to give up the joys of life. He turned his head slightly, as if glancing toward the distant treetops. "And though I no longer taste, thirst, or hunger. I remember enough to respect what was lost. That is enough. But it wasn't. Not truly. He missed it. The warmth of a real meal, the slow burn of good liquor, rare as those expensive pleasures had been in his old life. The texture, the aroma, the quiet ritual of it all. Even the gel-based nutritional packs, bland, synthetic flavors, but oddly comforting, had their place in the rhythm of living. He would never voice such sentiments. He couldn't. Yet now, holding a cup he could never lift to his lips, the absence pressed against him with surprising weight. It ached more than he expected. Aaron saw it, or sensed it. Something subtle in the way ainz's voice had softened, in the way the glowing coals within his eyes dimmed ever so slightly. He could not fathom what it meant to carry such a curse, so immense, so final. A form that granted power, at the cost of every human joy. He cleared his throat softly and nodded, as if affirming something unspoken. Then, with gentle tact, he shifted the subject. "Did you have trouble during the night?" he asked. "No," ainz replied. "Nothing approached. I was watching. It is the least I could do." His voice was calm, almost gentle, betraying none of the shadows that had plagued him hours before. He buried them. Deep. Aaron nodded again, a weary relief in his eyes. "We're grateful. Truly. It was a hard night. But we managed. Thanks to you." "I am glad to hear that." Ainz shifted his gaze to the activity at their camp. "What is your plan now?" Aaron's smile faltered. "Our horses, they haven't returned. They're trained to come back even under duress, but—" He trailed off. "I fear the worst." Ainz turned to face him more directly. "I see. How far is the village?" "By horse. We'd be there by sundown if we're lucky. On foot, it could take a day or two, especially if those things are still in the forest." Ainz stood. The motion was slow, deliberate, his robes unfurling like a curtain caught in windless air. The tea still in his hand, warm, enticing, untouched. "Your horses may yet return," Ainz said. "But if they do not, I will think of a solution." Aaron looked at him, brows knit with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "You might be able to get us there?" Ainz paused, the silence deliberate. His gaze drifted for a moment, calculating. He had to be careful. Knowledge was power, and in the wrong hands, even a detail could become a weapon. "Yes," he said at last, measured and composed. "I have methods, but they require prior familiarity with the destination. I must have visited the place myself." He let the words settle before adding, with subtle finality, "Unfortunately, I have not." Aaron blinked, his brow furrowing slightly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the explanation brushed against the edge of understanding, but refused to settle into something clear. Ainz noticed the flicker of uncertainty in Aaron's eyes and continued, adjusting his tone with practiced ease. "I may have other, more conventional means," he said, offering a reassuring nod. "But I would prefer to wait a while longer before deciding. There is no need to waste resources unnecessarily. Rest assured, we are not without options." Aaron exhaled slowly, nodding with quiet relief. But as his gaze drifted toward the tree lean, the faint glow in his expression dulled, not from doubt in Ainz, but at the grim likelihood that their horses hadn't survived the night. "We'll try calling for them again," he said softly. Then, after a pause, his voice grew lower, tinged with quiet weight. "There's also one last thing we need to do before we can leave." Aaron turned to go, but Ainz remained standing, still holding the mug. Steam continued to curl from it, soft, fragrant tendrils that danced in the morning light. "I see," Ainz said quietly, his tone dipped in solemn understanding. "Then I will remain nearby, until your final duty is done." His voice did not waver. Yet there was something in the way he spoke, a stillness, a weight behind the words, a respect for the gravity of what Aaron had left unsaid. Ainz raised the mug slightly, just beneath the hollow shadow of where his nose once was. The smell reached him again. Warm, earthy, slightly floral. He didn't know the blend, perhaps some sort of mint leaf and honey, but it smelled kind, honest, familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. And yet, it would remain only a scent. The taste, whatever comfort it carried, would never reach him. A quiet loss, made sharper by its simplicity. He stood there a while longer. Then with a flick of thought, he dispelled alert. The glyphs vanished in a ripple, like sand brushed away by wind. Aaron and another man moved along the camp's edge, their footsteps careful as they scanned the forest beyond. Every so often, they called out, names, whistles, fragments of familiar cues meant to coax a response from the trees. Their voices were loud, a touch too loud, carrying with them a note of hope that rang just sharp enough to betray something else beneath it. Desperation, not yet panic, but close enough to feel. Ainz listened in silence, saying nothing, but hearing everything. The camp behind him stirred to life. Crackling fire, murmured voices. Someone laughed, gently. Another stoked the flames, coughing from the smoke. It was simple, like a scene from an old tale. The kind where the danger had passed, and the heroes lived quietly for a time. Ainz knew better, but still, he let himself close his eyes. The mug in his hand, the faint warmth on his bones, the smell of tea, the sound of life, quiet and tentative. It was not peace. Not really, but it was something close. And for this moment, he chose to stay in it. The light had fully broken across the treetops by the time Aaron returned to camp. Ainz, still standing at the edge of the clearing, watched him rejoin the others with quiet words and a bowed head. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Hope and relief faded beneath the weight of something unspoken, something everyone had known was coming. The second man stepped forward shortly after, returning from the tree-line to enter the camp with grim purpose. He came out with 2 shovels in hand. Ainz observed the moment without speaking, a quiet unease settling over his thoughts. Aaron followed him, taking one of the shovels without a word, and together the 2 men walked the path leading back to where the guard had fallen last night. There was no ceremony, no drawn breath or signal, only quiet footsteps and the soft crunch of dirt and ash beneath their boots. The scene they approached had long since grown still. Whatever remained of the guard lay where the beasts had descended, where they had preyed upon him, feasted until there was barely anything left worth saving. A patch of blackened grass, a smear of old blood, a few scorched scraps of cloth, nothing that resembled a person, just the remains of a final moment, scattered and impersonal. And yet, they knelt. They knelt slowly, reverently, their fingers moving with trembling care as they gathered every piece, no matter how small. Each tatter was handled with quiet sorrow. They placed them gently into a length of cloth, folding it like one would cradle something fragile, something loved. They did not cry yet, but their silence throbbed like a wound. Ainz watched as they made their way farther down the path, to a small glade just off the roadside. The grass there was greener. Wildflowers dotted the earth. There, they began to dig, slow, steady, shoulders bowed with the weight of the act. Each motion of the shovel was deliberate, a rhythm not of labor, but of grief. The rest of the camp emerged not long after. One by one, drawn by the silence, by the understanding that something final was being prepared. They gathered at the edge of the clearing, heads bowed, arms crossed or clasped, some simply holding each other. No one spoke. No one needed to. Then the sounds began. Muffled sobs broke the silence. Hands rose to cover faces, as if to hold the grief inside. Someone whispered the guard's name, Hartwin, softly, reverently, like a secret that needed to be spoken before it faded into dust. Ainz remained behind them all, standing, distant, uncertain. Should he join them? Would his presence be comfort or shadow? He waited, observed. No one stopped him when he stepped forward. A few glanced over their shoulders, but their eyes were clouded, not with fear, but sorrow. There was no space left in their hearts for panic. He stood a few meters away, cloaked in his own silence. The group made room without asking him to leave. Rain was held close by his mother, tucked under one arm, his sister in the other. His face was blotched red from crying. Ainz looked at him, really looked, and felt something. Not sadness, exactly. Not guilt, but something close. A reflective ache. A distant echo. He listened to the murmured eulogies. Fragmented sentences. Remembrances passed gently from one voice to another. He was brave, someone said. Always volunteered first. He hated onions, another added, with a faint smile, but he ate them anyway. Claimed he didn't want to offend the cook. He was scared, a quieter voice murmured, but he never ran. There were no grand speeches, no sermons, just the soft threads of a man's life, spoken plainly by those who had known him, each memory like a stitch, binding the presence of the fallen to the moment. And slowly, something in the atmosphere shifted. A chuckle escaped, then another, a tearful laugh, followed by a fond story of a misfired crossbow bolt that landed squarely in the cookpot. For a moment, the sorrow lightened, not vanished, but gentled, as if grief itself had softened in the warmth of shared remembrance. The mood remained subdued, but not hollow. It no longer clung with despair, it rang with affection, as if, in honoring the man, they were not mourning an end, but acknowledging a journey, a life that had walked alongside theirs. A thread cut, but not forgotten. Ainz observed in silence, the glowing embers of his gaze dim. It was strange. Despite their pain, their voices reached for memories, not the corpse. Laughter mingled with tears. Regret gave way to stories. He wondered if, in this world, the weight of death was carried differently. Less on the shoulders, more in the heart. Less a fixation on the lifeless, and more a devotion to what had lived. He should have felt something. That knowledge sat like a stone in his mind, a quiet recognition that this moment ought to move him. That grief, or sorrow, or even solemn respect should rise unbidden. But there was only silence where the feeling should be. He did not know this man. There was no tether, no shared memory, no flicker of connection. His death had been tragic, yes, but distant, like reading a name carved into a grave you'd never seen before, in a language only half understood. The only sensation he could trace was the echo of Rain's grief, raw, honest, human. That was the only bridge between them. A borrowed sadness, nothing of his own. The resurrection wands flickered through his mind. He had several, powerful items, each with limited charges, far too valuable to use lightly. Would resurrection magic even function in this world? And if it did, would the cost be the same as an Yggdrasil? Or something far worse, vitality drained, fragments of the soul torn away, memories lost in the crossing? And if there were gods in this world, true gods, not systems or code, would they tolerate such an act? Would they intervene? Punish him? Too dangerous, too valuable, and far too many unknowns. He shelved the thoughts with a cold, inward click. His gaze then lingered briefly on the makeshift grave. No, he would not waste a charge on Hartwin. Sentiment had its place, but strategy demanded restraint. Yet, Rain, that boy's illness gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. Could resurrection bypass it entirely? Cleanse the disease through death and rebirth? It was a theory, and proven, reckless. But if the sickness ran too deep, if the body failed, could death be undone, and the ailment left behind? He would need to investigate. Understand the disease's nature, whether it was magical, spiritual, or something else entirely. Only then could he even consider using one of the wands. Not yet. Not without answers. The two men gently lowered the wrapped remains into the earth. A deep silence fell. They took turns covering the body, the dull thuds of dirt landing with slow finality. Then came the wildflowers. A small handful, plucked from the glade, were laid atop the mound. Pink, yellow, violet. They lay there uncertainly, beautiful and insufficient. A few survivors looked around, glancing toward the trees. Their brows furrowed, searching for a stone, a carving, anything. Some marked to say, "Here lies someone who mattered." They found nothing. Ainz stepped forward. They felt him this time. The weight of his presence was unmistakable, like a shadow moving against the sun. The group parted instinctively, stepping back. Not with fear, but something akin to reverence. He stopped at the foot of the mound. The smell of earth was thick in the air. The wildflowers fluttered in the breeze. It was peaceful. He stared down. Still, he felt almost nothing. Just the weight of reflection. He forced himself to speak. "I cannot claim to have known him," Ainz said, voice low, stripped of grandeur. "But his actions, and your remembrance, speak clearly of his character. Because of him, I arrived in time to act. Barely, but it was enough." He paused, not for grief, but to measure the space where grief should have been. He hadn't felt it, not truly, but he understood the need for such words. The moment demanded them. So he shaped them carefully, as one might shape glass, deliberate, clear, and cool to the touch. Fragile only if examined too closely. He thought of Rain, of his small, trembling voice, the cracks in it when he spoke of the guard's death the night before. That pain was real, palpable. Ainz remembered it, held it in place, tried to align his voice to it. It was not empathy, not exactly, but it was something close enough to wear. A mask, a necessary one. And so the lie continued. not to deceive, but to hold the shape of the man he still wished to be, or at least the one he needed them to believe he was. And in the stillness that followed, another thought lingered, one he did not voice. The man did not need to die. If he had acted the moment he arrived at the scene, without hesitation or observation, perhaps he could have saved him. But he could not afford recklessness. He had watched, measured, then moved. It was the only way to remain in control. And even now, with the means to reverse death at his fingertips, he would not. The wands were too valuable, too rare. He would not waste them, not for a stranger, not for a sentiment that wasn't his own. It provided no benefit, and the loss weighed little compared to what he might yet need to preserve. He would not rewrite what had passed. Ainz raised a skeletal hand and murmured, "Create greater item." A pulse of magic swelled silently. The air shimmered, and from nothing, a monument began to form. Dark stone emerged, obsidian-like, smooth and veined with faint silver lines that caught the sunlight like old starlight. The headstone rose from the earth behind the grave, tall and gently curved, its edges etched with the suggestion of ancient runes, the kind found on monuments meant to endure. It stood in quiet authority, regal, somber, and unyielding. It would not weather. It would not fall. This was what he could offer. Not words, not warmth, but permanence. A marker that would stand long after the memory faded. Ainz regarded it in silence, and in that stillness came a quiet conviction. It was fair. His only contribution to the man's burial, to his death, and whatever life he had led. The group stared, wide-eyed. A few murmured their thanks. Others simply nodded, eyes lowered, lips pressed tight. Rain looked up at Ainz, eyes rimmed with red. He gave a soft, trembling smile. Ainz said nothing. He simply lowered his hand and stepped back. Time passed. Eventually, one by one, they returned to camp. Conversation resumed, quieter now. Grief still lingered, but it had changed shape. It had moved from pain to remembrance. Laughter returned, hesitantly. Someone began to portion food. A few tried to entertain the children. Life, fragile and persistent, crept forward. But Ainz remained behind. He stood alone before the grave. The wind stirred his robe gently. He stared at the tombstone, then the flowers, the dirt, the shape of a life reduced to a mound. How small it all seemed. How finite. He thought of the difference between them. He, who could never die, and this man, who had been gone in an instant. This is what it means to be mortal, he thought. To live so briefly, to vanish so easily, to be remembered by voices that will one day vanish too. And then he thought of himself. Was he envious? Perhaps. What he had was power, eternal, unyielding, godlike. But what they had was meaning. A pulse, an arc, a finality that made every moment matter. The breeze stirred gently as Ainz lingered by the grave, the wild flowers trembling slightly in the wind's grasp. His gaze had drifted beyond them, to water. A narrow creek wound its way just beyond the burial site, thin, clear, and quiet. Its flow shimmered in the early light, curling through stones and roots like silver thread unraveling across green fabric. Ainz found himself watching it without realizing, his thoughts momentarily drowned in the soft current. The sound of trickling water, delicate and unbroken, had a rhythm to it. Hypnotic, calming. He walked toward it, slow, composed, each step marked by quiet grace. His robe swept the grass with barely a whisper, and when he sat at its edge, it was with the practiced poise of a king before his court, elegant, measured, timeless. For a long while, he did not move. His sockets followed the stream as it curved lazily through its bed, splashing against smooth stones and brushing wildflowers with playful laps. Lavender, primrose, and wild clover bloomed freely here, untouched by flame or violence. His magic had spared this patch by little more than accident. Just a few dozen meters off, and all of it would have been scorched. Erased. He almost felt guilty. How fragile it all was. How easily destroyed. And yet it endured. His gaze drifted downward, settling on a single flower among the untouched grass, its petals pale violet, its stem delicate, trembling faintly in the breeze. Slowly, carefully, Ainz crouched and reached out. His fingers closed around it with the care of someone holding something breakable. He brought it closer to his skull, just beneath the hollow shadow of where his nose once was. He could still smell it. Faint and clean. A trace of earth, sweetness, and something light, like spring before the first rain. He studied it for a long moment, unmoving. The somber weight he'd carried felt lighter here, not gone, but softened. The silence of the dead had been replaced with the breath of life, and he let it in. Slowly, quietly. The breeze, the flowers, the creek. It wasn't peace, not truly. But it was the closest he had felt since those first strange moments after his arrival, when the silence of this world had briefly embraced him. He allowed himself to feel it. The sounds of tools reached him. Hammers. Wood scraping. The metallic creak of something being fitted into place. His head turned slightly, and the spell of the creek broke. He rose, robes whispering softly as he stepped away from the stream. One last look to the headstone, then to the patch of flowers. He lingered. The flower still rested in his hand. For a moment, he gazed at it once more, its soft color, its quiet defiance against the ruin. Then, with deliberate care, he stored it in his inventory. And he walked, back toward the world, toward reality. When he returned to the vicinity of the camp, he found several of the men gathered near the wagons. They were working, hunched over wheels and axles, inspecting splintered joints, replacing cracked braces, checking every inch of the old wood. The wagons were worn but serviceable, the kind once common on rough roads in less traveled lands. Boxy, wooden frames with large wheels, high seats at the front for four, and a covered rear lined with rough canvas and iron braces. The rear space could carry cargo or a handful of extra passengers, though comfort was clearly an afterthought. Not far from them, laid out beside the campfire, the other guard still lay unconscious. He was wrapped in warm blankets, his face pale but peaceful, breath steady. Someone had placed a folded cloth beneath his head, and a bowl of water rested nearby, half full and steaming faintly. Even in sleep, he was being watched over. Ainz approached the stone perimeter. With calm authority, he addressed them. "Do you require assistance?" Aaron turned at the sound, wiping his hands on a cloth. He smiled, tired but appreciative. "No, thank you, Sir Gown. We should have them ready soon," he said as he stepped closer, glancing at the walls of rock still encasing their temporary haven. "Actually, do you think you could bring these down now? We'll need the space to move the wagons soon." Ainz nodded. "Step back, please." They obeyed. Ainz raised one hand, fingers splayed, and the air grew still. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, his palm lowering as if pushing down the sky itself, the walls responded. Stone cracked, the earth shuddered, and then, with a low, grinding sound, the boulders and barriers crumbled inward and sank, swallowed by the ground like they had never existed at all. Dust rose briefly, then faded. The way was open. A few of the survivors shifted uneasily, casting cautious looks at the now exposed clearing. The safety they'd known in the enclosure was gone, but they made no complaints. Aaron followed Ainz as he stepped back from the spell's remnants. His expression was different now, something quiet tugging at the edges. "The horses haven't returned," he said softly. "I think they're gone for good." There was a pause. His voice dropped even lower. "I had one of them for 8 years." Ainz didn't speak at first. He looked at Aaron, at the man's rough hands, the sadness in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Ainz said gently. "I know what it's like to lose something you've had for so long." Aaron gave a faint nod. "I'll manage. But we can't afford to walk. Not with the forest still crawling." Ainz tapped a finger over his jaw, thinking, strategizing. "I have a solution," he said, "though it may be uncomfortable for some." Aaron looked up, curious. "Anything, Sir Gown. We need to reach the village." Ainz hesitated. Then, after a moment's pause, he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "My magic. Do you know its affinity? The kind of power it draws upon." Aaron hesitated, uncertain. I'm not sure, sir." Ainz inclined his head slightly. "Necromancy," he said, the word falling like a stone into still water. "I command the dead. I can summon servants, beings drawn from the essence of death itself. They are loyal, tireless, and bound completely to my will." His voice lowered, not with shame, but with caution. "That is to say, I can conjure skeletal horses." Silence followed. Aaron's eyes widened, not in terror, but something close. The color bled from his cheeks, and he glanced away for the barest moment before collecting himself. When he looked back, his voice was quiet, but steady. "If they'll carry us safely," he said, offering a faint, respectful nod, "then I'll make sure the others understand. You've done more than enough. We trust you. Ainz nodded once. Good. I'd prefer to avoid unnecessary panic. Please inform them. Aaron returned to the camp, speaking low and calm. A small circle formed, murmurs rising. Some were surprised, others tense. A few voices grew sharper. The older woman gasped. But eventually, the tone settled. No one shouted. No one ran. Aaron turned and gave Ainz a slow, firm nod. I hope this works. Ainz walked toward the wagons. He raised his voice, calm and regal. I will now summon steeds for your wagons. They nodded, eyes wide, silent. With a slow, deliberate motion, Ainz lifted his hand. Create middle-tier undead, soul eater. Black tendrils of magic unfurled from his palm, slithering across the grass with unnatural grace. They snaked toward the front of each wagon, and the earth beneath them twisted, hollowed, and parted. From the churned soil, they emerged. Skeletal figures rose, horses in shape, but unlike any living beast. Their bodies were pure bone, bleached and pristine, save for the writhing, spectral light that danced within them. It pulsed in their chests, a ghostly heart of flame. Threads of that same fire coiled through their forms like sinew, wrapping ribs and limbs in ethereal muscle. Where manes should have been, fire flared, like living embers whipped by a wind that did not blow. Their eye sockets glowed faintly, twin coals set deep in ivory skulls, the light within them shimmering with a fierce, silent energy. Rising from their foreheads, a set of jagged horns curved back like those of a bull, only sharper, crueler, as if carved for war rather than nature. Ainz stood still, watching the group carefully. Some flinched at the sight of the skeletal steeds, their bone-white forms so similar to his own. The little girl whimpered softly, clinging to her mother's leg. But no one ran. No one screamed. They held their ground, uneasy, uncertain, yet willing to remain. And slowly, their expressions began to shift. Fear gave way to awe. Dread softened into something like wonder. The summoned steeds stood poised in silence, skeletal heads bowed, waiting for command. Ainz lowered his hand, satisfied. We may depart when you are ready, he said, his voice calm, assured. He felt no pride, not exactly. But in the hush that followed, as eyes lingered not with panic, but with trust, he sensed it. A purpose, a quiet triumph, shaped not by applause, but by acceptance. The soul eaters stood patiently at the front of the wagons, unmoving save for the subtle flicker of their flame-like manes. Ainz could feel their presence, faint, almost weightless. Contrary to their fearsome design, the soul eaters radiated no malice. Where there should have been hunger, rage, even, a strange stillness lingered instead. The connection lacked the seething fury of his death night. In truth, it lacked the sensation of thought at all. These creatures were simpler, hollow in purpose. Their minds were rudimentary, silent vessels driven by obedience and movement alone. He wondered, briefly, if their gentler nature had taken shape from his intent when summoning them. Soul eaters were meant for carnage, for charging through fields thick with blood and ash. But not here. Not now. Now, they simply existed. It surprised him. He had expected at least some trace of malice, a whisper of disdain toward the living, a distant echo of loathing, a default revulsion for life itself. He wondered, could my state of mind during the summoning influence their default behavior? Or could it be something else entirely at play, a difference in this world's foundational magic, and the way it is affecting me? Ainz stepped forward and approached the nearest soul eater, a tall, lean thing of bone and burning ether. Its head turned toward him at once, the faint glow in its sockets intensifying with recognition. It neighed. The sound, though hollow and spectral, carried a soft edge, almost comforting, almost alive. He moved his hand slowly toward the creature's head. His fingers passed gently across the top of its skull, the horns, and then swept downward through the flickering light of its mane. The flames bent around his hand, as though responding to warmth it could no longer feel. The skeletal horse leaned into his touch, like a living one would. Ainz turned to the group, his voice even and calm. I know they may appear intimidating, but these creatures are harmless. You can think of them as the ghosts of horses. They simply wish to serve. They do not tire. They do not sleep. They require no food or rest. In fact, they may get us to the village faster than a living steed. There was a long pause. The survivors watched in silence. One man muttered something under his breath. The skeletal horses pawed the ground lightly, waiting. One tossed its head gently, the flames of its mane fluttering without heat. Small, hesitant steps sounded through the group. It was Rain. The boy pulled away from his mother's hand, his small fingers slipping free as he stepped cautiously toward the horse Ainz had just petted. His mother reached forward instinctively, her body twitching as if to pull him back, but she stopped herself. Her hand lingered mid-air, frozen by hesitation, and then lowered slowly. Perhaps she saw something. Perhaps it was in Rain's face, not fear, but awe. Even the girl in her arms seemed curious now, her teary, wide brown eyes blinking with something else for the first time since the attack. Not dread, but wonder. Rain halted before the creature. Ainz nodded. "Good morning, Rain." The boy looked up at him. "Good morning, Mr. Ainz. Would you like to pet him?" Ainz asked, his tone gentle. Rain hesitated, the kind of hesitation only a child could show, torn between a lifetime of warnings and a moment of curiosity too bright to resist. Then he nodded. Ainz knelt slowly beside the spectral steed, careful not to disturb the creature's calm posture. The horse lowered its head obediently, its glowing sockets watching the boy with serene stillness. Rain reached out, his fingers trembling just slightly. Then he touched it. The bone was cool beneath his hand, but the flame light that danced through it pulsed gently against his skin. Not hot, not cold, just alive. The boy's fingers trailed across the forehead, then slowly moved to its neck. The horse responded with a soft chuff, a mimicry of life. "It feels like light," Rain whispered. Ainz nodded. "It does." Rain smiled. A real, full smile. His eyes lit up as he turned to his mother. "It's not scary," he said. "It's nice." She said nothing, but her face softened. The others began to move. They returned to their preparations, emboldened by the boy's bravery. They packed what supplies remained, sacks of food, preserved fruits, small crates of tools and textiles. Much had been lost the night before. Nearly half of it, Ainz estimated, burned, shattered, or scattered during the panic. Still, they gathered what they could. Their final act before departure was a quiet one, gently lifting the unconscious guard and laying him into the cargo hold of Aaron's wagon. He was wrapped in blankets, nestled carefully between bundles of supplies. Secured, protected, but out of sight. With that done, the others began climbing aboard the wagons in pairs and trios. The front seats were crude wooden benches mounted above the axle, while the rest of the wagons were covered by stretched canvas that shaded the cargo hold. Simple, functional designs, practical rather than comfortable. Iron nails pinned worn wheels into place, some still slightly crooked despite the morning's repairs. Ainz walked to the front of each wagon and secured the soul eaters with ethereal reins, ghostly strands conjured from the necks of the steeds, binding them to the harness. With a second gesture, he wove solid ropes from summoned fibers, attaching them to the phantom reins, giving the drivers something tangible to hold. There would be no need for leather, and no risk of touching the spectral material directly. They should respond like normal horses, he explained. The man sitting on the second wagon cleared his throat and extended a hand toward Ainz. His hand was calloused and marked with age. His beard was trimmed with silver, and his gray eyes were hard but honest. "Gerwalt," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Trader. Been working with Aaron for 6 years. Apologies for not introducing myself before." Ainz nodded. He reached out tentatively, extending a skeletal hand toward the man. Before making contact, he ensured his passives were suppressed. The last thing he needed was to have the man rot away in front of everyone. "Well met, Gerwalt. There's no need for apologies." Gerwalt gave a half-smile, the lines around his eyes deepening with weariness. "Can't say I've ever seen anything like them, but if they'll get us home, I'll call them a blessing." He rested a hand on the side of the wagon, eyes briefly drifting to the undead steed before returning to Ainz. No fear, not anymore, just fatigue, and a kind of quiet resolve. They shared a moment of silent understanding. Gerwalt was too tired for fear, too drained for formalities, and Ainz, in his own way, recognized it. Survival had stripped the need for questions and left no room for ceremony. As the final supplies were loaded, Ainz stood off to the side, quietly observing the group. And then it struck him. He didn't want to fly overhead like some ominous omen, nor did he care to perch awkwardly among crates in the back of a wagon. Or worse, jog alongside them like a lost hound. He wanted a steed of his own. He didn't move this time. No gesture, no spoken word, just will, made manifest. Dark tendrils slithered from his form, curling toward a spot beside the caravan. The ground trembled as the soil rippled. From the earth, another soul eater emerged, larger than the rest. Elegant, imposing. Its bones were pristine and gleaming, its frame built for both presence and strength. The light within it pulsed more vividly, red and golden threads that crackled like lightning beneath the surface of glass. Create greater item. A saddle took form on the creature's back, obsidian black, its curves sleek and elegant. The seat was high-backed and throne-like, with velvet lining of the deepest midnight. Ornate patterns traced in silver wove through its surface, Yggdrasil symbols etched in quiet reverence. It looked less like a riding saddle and more like something fit for a deathless king. He placed one hand on the horse's side and stepped up the ornate stirrups. The motion was smooth, practiced, though in truth, he had never ridden a horse in his life. But something about it felt natural. Ainz settled onto the seat. The saddle conformed perfectly to his frame. He sat tall and still, his robe cascading down either side like a flowing cloak, the light of the morning catching on the curved horns of his pauldrons. So this is what it feels like. He felt a strange twinge. Not nostalgia, but excitement. It was absurd. A skeleton on a skeletal horse, riding alongside a caravan of frightened merchants through a forest that looked torn from the pages of a fairy tale. I'm embarking on a journey, he thought. One with no script, no quest log, no fate set in stone. He turned his head and looked back. The wagons had grown still. The last of the ropes were tied down, hushed voices confirming supplies. The last will have been tested. The canvas draped over the wagons fluttered faintly in the breeze. Every face was turned toward him expectantly. They were ready. Ainz turned slightly in the saddle, the ethereal mane of his skeletal steed flickering softly in the breeze. The morning light slipped between the trees, gilding the ground in a patchwork of warmth and shadow. Then, calmly, he asked, Aaron, is the path ahead straightforward? The question hung in the air for a moment. Aaron blinked, tilting his head. A faint frown tugged at his brow. Sir Gawain, what do you mean? Ainz tilted his skull toward the trees, his voice smooth, his posture regal atop his throne-like saddle. I ask whether the path to your village is fixed and certain, or if there are branches. Crossroads. Old trails that become impassable with time or weather. Do some routes curve near danger, or vary by season? Aaron shifted his weight and nodded. Yes, actually. Depending on the rains, some roads flood. A few trails run near monster nests. Not dangerous ones, usually, but still. There are forks. We sometimes take the longer path if there's risk of trouble. Ainz closed his eyes briefly in thought. Then perhaps, he said, raising one hand with quiet finality, we would benefit from a guide. With a quiet gesture, he cast the spell, Blessing of Titania. A sphere of soft green light unfurled from his palm, small, no larger than a fruit, but impossibly delicate. Inside it shimmered the outline of translucent wings, beating in slow rhythm like a dream half remembered. The orb pulsed once, then blossomed, revealing a tiny, winged figure that hovered upward on a trail of golden motes. Its wings shone like dew-struck glass, its body faintly humanoid, wreathed in light and silence. Aaron stared, eyes wide. The others behind him mirrored his expression, a mix of awe and uncertainty. What is that? He asked in a whisper. Ainz's voice did not rise. It remained calm, commanding, as if speaking of something sacred and ancient. This is a pathfinding spell, he said. The Blessing of Titania. It is, in essence, a form of scrying, but layered with environmental awareness and the wisdom of the Fae. The summoned fairy will assess terrain, ambient mana, and unseen hazards along the route. It calculates danger. It chooses safety. She will lead us down the safest path. The fairy pulsed once, then turned, flitting ahead along the path. Ainz lowered his hand. Follow her. She will not lead you astray. Ride ahead, and I'll follow. Aaron murmured something under his breath, something half prayer, half thank you. With a jolt and creak of wood, the first wagon lurched forward. The soul eaters pulled without complaint, their hooves making almost no sound against the earth. The second followed closely behind, wheels rattling softly over the uneven path. Ainz turned his mount to face the road, lifted the dark, wispy reins, and the spectral horse marched onward. Far ahead, deep in the forest beyond their sight, something moved, heavy, fast, and relentless. The death night surged through the trees like a siege engine unleashed, its senses honed, its purpose singular. The tether between master and monster vibrated faintly in Ainz's mind, a distant presence that never blinked. It would patrol ahead, erase anything dangerous that threatens their path. Ainz closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence stretch. He thought of the corpse he used to create the Death Knight. I was so focused on power, on defense, I wasted a resource. I should have used dark wisdom to extract magic from the corpse. But instead, he had burned the vessel into something violent and blind. Would it have even worked? In Yggdrasil, dark wisdom had been an extraordinary ability, one that allowed him to vastly exceed the normal limits of magical knowledge. While most players could learn up to 300 spells, Ainz had used dark wisdom to internalize and master over 700. But even that came with boundaries. Once the set limit was reached, no amount of stolen or studied knowledge could push him further. Then again, this place wasn't Yggdrasil. He reasoned. Perhaps it would work. But what if this world used incantations or formulas beyond the game's boundaries? What if the spells here weren't constructed the same way? Would dark wisdom even recognize them? Would it simply fail? Or worse, would the spell try to force something into my mind that didn't fit? He clenched his skeletal fingers around the edge of his saddle. No tension showed. His bones made no sound. But the weight of uncertainty clung to him. There were too many unknowns. And he hated unknowns. Still, I should not have wasted that opportunity. Even if the odds were low. Even if the knowledge was fragmented. He had acted like a general. But not like a researcher. Not like a magic caster. The wagons creaked ahead of him, their occupants laughing softly. Rain's sister poked her head out beneath the tarp, pointing at something in the trees. He could see them, small human joys, renewed in motion. Ainz sat tall on his steed, magic mane dancing quietly in the wind. Next time, he thought, I will examine the remains first. I will not waste what I can still learn. If this world has magic I can wield, I will take it. All of it. And with that resolve, his thoughts, once tangled and restless, began to slow again. The rhythm of hooves on earth, the hush of wind through trees, the distant chirping of birds. All of it pressed softly against his awareness. The world returned to him, piece by piece, and for a while, Ainz simply listened. At first, the forest was dense, shadows pooled between trunks, the branches overhead forming a high canopy that filtered the morning sun into scattered shafts of gold. But as the path wound forward, the trees began to thin, and the land opened into low, rolling hills brushed with wildflowers. The wagons moved in a slow, steady rhythm. The battered wheels creaked softly over roots and uneven stones. The soul eaters pulled forward without a sound, their hooves gliding over dirt and grass as though weightless. Their ethereal manes flickered gently with each movement, the ghostly flames dancing back in the wind like streamers of will-o'-the-wisp fire. Ainz's own steed moved smoothly beneath him, responding to even the slightest pressure of his will. The ornate saddle remained perfectly still, unshaken by the terrain. The scattered calls of early birds, distant, infrequent, began to multiply as the day warmed. One by one, more voices joined the morning air, until the trees brimmed with chirps, trills, and fluttering wings in full chorus. Warblers, thrushes, and other birds unfamiliar to Ainz's old world sang from branch and bramble. Occasionally, he spotted one alight on a low branch. Vibrant blues, fiery reds, deep violets, colors too pure to be real, too vivid to be artificial. The fairy summoned by Blessing of Titania danced ahead of the caravan in slow loops and upward spirals, like a speck of living starlight. She would occasionally pause in midair, wings beating faintly, then alter direction with a sudden burst of movement. Each time, the path adjusted, left through a glade, right around a mound of moss-covered stone, or into shallow gullies that cut between the roots of ancient trees. It was not a road by human definition. It was a route known only to nature. Ainz rode in silence. But it was not an empty silence. It was warm, full, the kind of quiet that asked nothing of him, that expected nothing, the kind that allowed him to simply exist. He watched as the wagons dipped into a low stream. The wheels sank slightly into the mud. Water sloshed up the sides as the skeletal horses waded forward, unbothered. Rain and his sister giggled from beneath the canvas covers, laughing at the splash. One of them, Rain, peeked out again, small fingers clinging to the wooden side. He waved, grinning, the breeze pulling at his hair. Ainz raised a hand and returned the gesture. He was beginning to look forward to those little waves. The forest shifted again. They passed a small field dappled with flowers in hues of amber, violet, and white. Tiny silver insects zipped through the air in glimmering patterns. A fox darted across the trail at one point, its tail flashing like a comet. Even the breeze had changed. It carried the scent of pine, fresh earth, and faint sweetness from blooming clover. He could feel something ancient in it all, something untouched. This was not like the lands of Yggdrasil, no artificial terrain crafted from code and pixels. Nor was it like the polluted remnants of his dying world, choked by concrete, titanium, and glass. This was pure, alive. It felt like stepping backward in time, like wandering through the myths of a world where gods still roamed and magic filled the cracks that machines had never learned to reach. Ainz allowed himself to take it in, to absorb the moment in silence. He closed his eyes and exhaled, a breath he didn't need, but released all the same. His shoulders eased, the stiffness fading slightly, as the ancient beauty of the world settled within him like dust on still bones. For once, he was not an overlord, no great monarch of death, no master of dreadful power. He was not an undead, no skeletal husk cursed to outlive warmth and time. He was not a salaryman, no worn soul shackled to fluorescent lights, endless meetings, and the grind of schedules, sales quotas, and impossible expectations. He was merely a traveler, just one more figure on a quiet road. The hours passed gently. The world did not rush. The wagons rolled on, their wheels thudding over stones, their skeletal steeds silent save for the rhythmic clack of bone hooves on packed dirt. Grass gave way to winding trails hemmed in by low hills and moss-slick rocks. They passed under leafy arches where the trees bent close to one another, forming green tunnels lit by scattered sunlight. Clusters of pale mushrooms glowed faintly at the roots of ancient trunks, and golden birds flitted from branch to branch, their calls cheerful and unbothered. They passed a field blooming wild with dandelions and poppies, the petals dancing in the wind like soft embers. Then something strange crossed their path, lithe and low to the ground, its fur a rippling blend of emerald and fire gold, as if sunlight and moss had given birth to motion. Its many tails fanned behind it, each one trailing motes of color that faded like pollen in the air. Rain, fidgeting in the back of the wagon with his sister, grew momentarily quiet to watch. The critter paused, stared at them with curious violet eyes, then vanished into the brush without a sound. Ainz felt something stir, not quite emotion, but presence, connection. He watched the world move around him, untouched, unknowing of who or what he was, and felt as though he did not stand apart from it. He did not speak, and no one spoke to him, but the silence was not cold. It was soft, warm, like the hush of a shared fire or the stillness of prayer. When his eyes opened again, the sky had changed. The sun had already crept high and begun its descent. The vibrant blue of morning was shifting, deepening at the edges, warming to soft shades of amber. The clouds glowed faintly with oranges and rose-touched gold, stretched thin across the horizon. Long shadows stretched from trees and stones, and the sound of cicadas had begun to hum in waves beneath the rustle of leaves. It had been a good day, and somehow, he wished it wasn't ending. The wagon slowed. Ainz looked ahead. Aaron had pulled gently on the reins and stepped down from the front of the lead wagon. He was staring off to the right, where a small weathered shrine stood beneath a low overhang of ivy-draped stone. A cluster of carved symbols marked the road, familiar to him, clearly, ancient and unfamiliar to Ainz's eye. Aaron turned and called out softly, "Sir Gown." Ainz nudged his mount forward, drawing alongside. "Yes. We're nearly there, less than a quarter-mile now, I'd say. It should be safe from here on." Aaron nodded toward the stone. "That's a border shrine. It marks the edge of our village. We leave offerings there during the spring planting, for a plentiful season, and to keep the monsters away. There was a pause, a flicker of acknowledgement behind ainz's burning gaze. I see. How would you like to proceed? Aaron hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice calm but sincere. If you'll allow me, I'd like to walk the rest of the way. Just the last stretch. I can speak to the townsfolk and the elders, explain what happened, prepare them, so to speak. About you. He cast a glance at the soul eaters, his gaze holding a moment too long before drifting away, the faintest tension in his jaw betraying his unease. And about the creatures pulling the wagons. Best they hear it from someone they know first. Ainz regarded him for a long moment, then gave a slow, approving nod. A prudent approach. Sudden appearances often breed fear, and my presence has stirred more than enough of that already. Aaron gave a small, grateful smile. They'll listen to me. I'll make sure they understand what you've done for us. Very well, ainz said, his tone composed, faintly regal. I shall remain here with the others and stand watch. Take the time you need. And as Aaron moved forward on foot, his figure half silhouetted by the low sun, ainz remained seated upon his steed. The wind stirred his robe in slow, soundless waves, and the shadows at his feet stretched farther with each passing moment. The light of late day filtered through the trees, casting a warm haze over the path ahead. Even the birds had begun to quiet, their songs thinning into silence as dusk approached. Ainz simply settled, eyes drifting toward the forest, unmoving, patient, as the world exhaled around him. The sky deepened into soft golds and darker blues. The air was cooler, and the faint rustle of wind through the leaves no longer carried the heat of the day, but the first hints of evening. The sun continued its slow descent, a steady, golden march toward the horizon. And with that, ainz felt the first stirrings of caution begin to return. He marked the terrain carefully. He saw where the light would fail first, under low boughs, behind clusters of brush, along dips in the land. Potential blind spots. Future points of ambush. He commanded the Death Knight to move closer, to increase its vigilance. He remained still in his saddle, skeletal fingers resting lightly along the sculpted edge of his conjured throne, at ease in form, yet vigilant in thought. Sensing his summon draw nearer, ainz felt a faint sense of assurance settle over him. He allowed his gaze to shift toward the wagons. The survivors were chattering now, quietly, but with an energy that hadn't been present that morning. Rain kept poking his head out from behind the canvas cover, waving, smiling, bickering with his sister when she tried to copy him. Their mother, exasperated, gently tugged them back again and again. Ainz watched the exchange. Once again, it stirred something faint, not laughter, not joy, but something close. A warmth that might have once been called fondness. Somewhere deep within, he remembered the laughter of his old friends. The jokes, the way they teased one another. The memory stayed with him, unshaken, until the sound of hooves made him lift his gaze. Aaron had returned. The old man approached from the distance, mounted on a living horse, clearly not eager to make the walk back on foot. He quickly dismounted and tied the reins to a nearby tree. He approached with a sheepish, half-embarrassed smile. He looked tired but not defeated. I believe I've sorted things out, he said, his tone hopeful but careful. It took a good deal of explanation, persuasion, but I think they understand now. Ainz's gaze turned slowly toward him. You think they understand? He repeated, voice rich, deep, but touched with curiosity, perhaps some doubt. Aaron rubbed the back of his neck. Kind of. Well, understand enough. We've never had anything like this happen. Demons, yes. But an undead, a cursed mage made of bone, still in possession of his will, walking freely among us. He shook his head. His eyes then drifted to the spectral steed. Plus our wagons being ferried by skeletal horses you've summoned from thin air. It was a lot. Ainz released a low, gravelly sound. Something like a chuckle, though not quite human. It's quite understandable, he said with a faint, amused lilt. Hearing such things must have sounded like a fever dream, or the beginning of a nightmare. I can hardly fault anyone for their fear or caution. It is not my intention to bring unrest. No, Aaron said quickly. You won't. You haven't. You've done more than any of us could have hoped. I wanted to prepare you. Some may be wary, but they've agreed. You'll be welcomed. We'll make it work. Ainz was silent for a moment. His glowing eyes flickered faintly. Very well, he said at last. voice even noble. I only hope my presence does not cause more trouble than it is worth. If needed, I can simply take my leave. Aaron's smile returned. Honest. Small. Sir Gown, you saved our lives. That is worth something. You can stay with us for as long as you like. Ainz did not answer aloud, but internally, his thoughts stirred. I will visit. Briefly. Enough to observe. Enough to learn. Once I have the information I need, I'll leave. Staying too long. He did not finish the thought. Aaron turned back to the wagons and signaled to the woman now holding the reins. She hesitated at first, then gave a small nod and gently flicked them. The wagons began to move again, the skeletal horses pulling in silence, their eerie, flame-like manes fluttering in the breeze. Aaron swung back onto his horse and rode ahead, leading the procession forward. Ainz remained behind for a moment, watching the ferry summoned by Blessing of Titania continue onward. It flickered faster now, a signal that the destination was near. So, Ainz mused as his spectral horse began to move. The village has dealt with demons. That's convenient. I need to learn more. If the villagers have survived such encounters, they might have texts, oral accounts, even data on their weaknesses, resistances, and magic abilities. If he could understand this world's demons, their magic, their nature, their origins, it would better prepare him for any future encounters. But demons were only one danger among many. He needed to learn more about this world's magical creatures, its monsters, its predators, be they magic, divine, or mundane. Tactics encounters would not be enough. He needed to grasp the foundations of this world's magic, how it flowed, how it was shaped, what laws governed it. Was it bound to will, to knowledge, to lineage, or divine favor? He needed to know its deities, if they truly existed. Were they real, thinking entities, or abstract forces? Did they grant blessings, demand worship, punish transgressions? And beyond the demons and monsters, what of the humans? Their factions, their loyalties, their capacity for war? In a world where the arcane and divine intertwined, a blade in the dark could be just as dangerous as a spell. Ainz had no intention of being caught unprepared. If they have a library, I will find it. Even a modest village might possess a few tomes, local histories, folk tales, notes on monsters, diseases, and magic. Anything could be a thread worth tugging. It would be a start, a foothold, but eventually, he would need more. Cities, larger, older, steeped in knowledge and ambition, would hold deeper reservoirs of understanding. Archives, guilds, temples, universities, perhaps even places where magic was studied, cataloged, challenged. There, the true shape of this world might begin to unfold, and he would be watching, listening, learning, because ignorance, in a world like this, was not just dangerous and foolish, it could prove fatal, even for someone like him. The trees thinned further. A few minutes later, the forest gave way to light and open skies. The dirt path flattened and widened, and ahead of them lay a stretch of gently sloping meadow, lush with wild grass and swaying with 1,000 flowers. Lavender and clover, tiny bell-shaped blooms in hues of yellow and blue, and tall stalks dusted with white drifted in the wind. The perimeter of the village was visible beyond. No tall walls, guards, or imposing gates. Only an old, waist-high wooden fence, more symbolic than defensive, the kind meant to keep livestock from wandering, not armies or monsters at bay. This is woefully insufficient, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. A barrier in name only. If even a single enemy passed through the forest's edge, they would have nothing to stop it. His tone remained calm, but there was a note of concern beneath it, measured, assessing. At the village's entrance stood a tall wooden archway, carved with care, its surface softened by years of wind and weather. No gate, just open arms. It was both alarming and endearing. From there, his eyes drifted to the village itself. Old stone and brickwork formed its heart, buildings with deep, wood-framed windows. Most rooftops were thatched with straw, sun-bleached, and weather-worn, with only one or two bearing tile in warm reds or browns, likely remnants of better years or wealthier residents. Some walls were draped with ivy, others ringed by simple flower beds, tended with care that outweighed their cost. A small stream curved around one side of the village, bordered by low stone barriers that diverted its flow to a watermill. It looked unreal, like a storybook he might have flipped through as a boy. pages filled with cottages and kind shopkeepers, where danger was always far away and sunsets never burned. Ainz slowed his steed. The sound of its skeletal hooves on the dirt road was muffled by the grass, but even so, it felt jarring against the peace ahead. The wind carried the scent of hay, baked bread, and flowers. Distant birds called, their song lilting through the sky now tinged with amber. It was a captivating sight. This was a world untouched by the relentless sprawl of industry. No towers of glass scraping at a poisoned sky, no ceaseless hum of machines, no glow of neon over broken streets. Just the honest rhythm of life, simple, unhurried, and clean in a way his old world had long forgotten. He raised a hand slowly, as if in reverence. "This world," he said quietly, voice low and resonant, "reminds me of a dream long forgotten." And as the final slant of light bathed the rooftops in gold, ainz's gown sat atop his ghostly steed, a dark silhouette against a land of color, a memory of death approaching a place so full of life. The gravel shifted beneath the wagon wheels as the road dipped gently toward the village proper. The final stretch of their journey carried a different sound, not the muffled rustle of grass or the steady thrum of dirt, but the distinct, uneven grumble of crushed stone. It was the sound of arrival. A handful of villagers had already gathered, their expectant, anxious, faces squinting in the falling sunlight. Ainz slowed his soul eater to a stop. The spectral horse responded instantly, flame-like, mane flickering low and quiet. He drew further back, allowing the two wagons to continue ahead of him, single file. The archway only permitted one at a time. The villagers' expressions turned quickly from joy to hesitation. Cheers and murmurs of relief rose at first, hands raised, waving, hopeful. But the moment their eyes landed on the ghastly creatures pulling the wagons, the joy faltered. Voices dropped. Faces stiffened. Fear. Contained, measured, but still there. Yet they did not flee. No one screamed. They made space. They allowed the wagons to enter. The first wagon groaned to a halt just past the archway, the skeletal horse stamping a hoof softly, as if satisfied with the journey's end. The second followed, the sharp clatter of wood and axle echoing briefly against the stone walls and tight streets beyond. And then, the relief returned. The moment the villagers saw the survivors, they leapt from the wagons, clasping hands, throwing arms around friends and loved ones. Voices overlapped, half-formed words turning to cries, to laughter, to choked sobs. There were tears, yes, but they fell with joy, not sorrow. The weight of fear gave way to reunion. For a few fleeting moments, even the soul eaters stood forgotten, strange, silent silhouettes lingering at the edge of sight, too unreal to confront in the presence of such raw emotion. A few villagers hurried to the rear wagon, where the sleeping guard still lay. They climbed up with practiced care, speaking in hushed tones as they arranged a stretcher from cloaks and spare wood. Two men lifted him, one on each side, while another guided their path, eyes watchful, steps steady. Though fast asleep, the guard looked peaceful, his breath even beneath the folds of his blanket. Ainz watched as they carried him off toward the far side of the village, likely to some healer or quiet place of rest. He idly wondered when the man would wake. Was it the lingering effect of the healing potion? He thought. Or something deeper. Mental trauma, perhaps. He would need to find out later. For now, the living were being reclaimed by their lives. And he remained on the threshold, half welcomed, half still apart. As he waited, the shadows from the setting sun painted his skeletal form in long, twisted strokes, like the outline of some distant legend come walking through the woods. He remained unnoticed, until Aaron stepped forward and called his name. That one word, simple and loud, shifted the world. Every eye turned. It was as if he had barged into a meeting, the door slamming behind him louder than intended, arriving 10 minutes late, unprepared, with a dozen unfamiliar faces staring, including one of his supervisors. There was that same sudden drop in the air pressure, the phantom weight settling on his shoulders. That same unnatural stillness. That same thrum of spotlight, silent, blinding, and inescapable. Gasps fluttered across the crowd. They stared. At the skeletal hands resting upon the reins. At the robe draped like oil over bleached bone. At the crimson glow within his chest, the world item, ever pulsing. And finally, they met the dim, infernal light burning in his eye sockets. A monster, an anomaly, a legend, or a curse. But they had known demons. They had survived monsters. So the fear shifted, softened. Perhaps it was Aaron's words. Perhaps it was the stories already whispered by those who had returned, about how this cursed one had saved them. Perhaps it was just the tired faces beside the wagons vouching for him, standing calmly near the undead steeds. Maybe it was the way ainz hesitated, the way he made no move to approach. He simply watched, waiting. Perhaps villagers saw it, the uncertainty, a sign, however small, that this entity understood customs and respect. That maybe he had once been human. A man near the front lifted a hand. A wave, small, unsure. Another followed. Then a woman. Then a cluster. Welcoming gestures, nervous but sincere. Ainz moved. He dismounted in a motion that was almost too smooth to be real, like a statue deciding to flow rather than fall. His robe trailed behind him, his every step calculated, unhurried, regal. He stepped beneath the archway and into the golden light of the village, then bowed, not low, but with practiced grace he hadn't known he possessed. The motion flowed through him with an ease that startled him, as if his body, this skeletal vessel of robes and magic, remembered how to be a king even when he did not. It was precise, controlled, a gesture of respect that carried the weight of command. "Greetings. I am ainz, he said, his voice deep, measured, dignified. It rolled over the gathered crowd like distant thunder, low, deliberate, calm. I wish to extend my gratitude to you all for allowing me to step into your home, even in spite of my appearance." The silence held. I promised Aaron and the others they would arrive safely. And so they have. That same promise I now extend to you. While I remain here, your safety is my concern. Murmurs followed, not of fear, but of surprise. Curiosity. There are still monsters in the forest, ainz continued, his tone laden with caution. But I have left a guardian posted outside the village. One that will deter and eliminate anything foolish enough to draw near. Silence held. No questions, only tentative nods. Shoulders unclenched, arms lowered, and wary faces softened as his presence settled over them. Even those who remained wary couldn't deny the effect of his voice. The calm authority in it, measured, unwavering, utterly assured, spoke of control and strength. It carried the weight of someone who would protect them and the ability to make that promise real. Aaron stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "Sir Gaun, I thank you again. We wouldn't have made it without you. Not a chance." Gerwalt, standing just beside him, mirrored the gesture. The two bowed together, shoulders squared, eyes steady. A moment later, the rest of the survivors followed suit, their movements calm and unhurried. There was no hesitation in their posture, only quiet respect and the worn gravity of those who had endured and still chose to stand tall. Aaron straightened and glanced toward the waiting wagons. "I don't mean to rush anything, but some of the supplies need to be delivered before nightfall. A portion of the food's already at the brink of spoiling. We can't let it sit much longer." Ainz inclined his head, his tone gracious and composed. "Of course, duty comes first. Go with my blessing, Aaron. You've done well." His voice remained steady, his bearing calm, kingly without arrogance, generous without boast. Aaron turned slightly, gesturing toward a man limping his way toward them. "That's Wenzel, an old friend. Bit of a talker, a little loud, a little nosy, but I'd trust him with my life." He gave a tired smile, then added, "He'll take things from here. Show you around the village, get you acquainted. He knows where everything is, lodging, common areas, all of it." His tone was light, but there was a note of trust in it. "You'll be in good hands." Before ainz could respond, Wenzel's voice cut in, warm, rough, with the rasp of dry straw and the edge of laughter beneath it. "Why now, I heard that. You'll make me sound like an old hen." He frowned and crossed his arms, though the glint in his tone betrayed more amusement than offense. Ainz turned to face Wenzel. The man was short, with a straw hat perched low over scraggly gray hair. A matching mustache curled faintly at the corners of his mouth. His brown coat had seen better days, and the gray shirt beneath it was held closed by mismatched buttons. His back was hunched with age, but he stood as straight as he could, proud, unshaken, nearly without a trace of fear. As he neared, Wenzel had to crane his neck to meet Ainz's gaze, his eyes squinting upward beneath layers of kindly wrinkles. He offered a wide, weathered smile. "Well now, you certainly know how to make an entrance," the old man said, tipping his straw hat with a crooked smile. "Welcome to Bach, mister. Don't mind old Aaron. He talks like I'm a pain, but I'm far better company than he lets on." He stepped a bit closer, grinning up at the skeletal figure before him. "Name's Wenzel, as the old fart said. I've been around longer than most, seen my fair share of strange things. But you?" His eyes flicked over Ainz's towering form. "You're right up there." He paused, then chuckled. "And I mean that literally, too. You're enormous. Scary as hell, if I'm honest. If we hadn't met under friendly terms, I'd probably be on my knees right now, begging for my life." Despite the words, there was no tremble in his voice. Just a mix of humor, awe, and the kind of honesty that only came from someone who'd seen enough not to lie. To any outsider, the situation would have seemed absurd. Death itself, befriending a village, protecting farmers and tradesmen like some wandering knight of bone and shadow. Ainz let out a low, resonant chuckle at the thought, a deep, steady sound that rumbled through his chest like thunder rolling beneath the earth. It didn't shake the ground, but it settled in the bones of those who heard it. "I am growing accustomed to being perceived as imposing," Ainz said, his tone steady but touched with dry amusement. "Though I am grateful we met under peaceful terms. I've no desire to see good men grovel at my feet, least of all those who greet me with honesty and a steady gaze." He inclined his head slightly, a regal gesture more felt than exaggerated. "I may look the part of a nightmare, but I assure you, I much prefer conversation to cries for mercy." Wenzel chuckled, patting his hands against his coat. "Well, I'm glad to hear it," he said lightly. "Had a hunch this village might not still be standing if you'd felt otherwise." He grinned as if joking, but there was a flicker of truth behind the warmth in his tone. Polite, careful truth. The kind spoken by someone who knew power when he saw it, and just how thin the line could be between guest and calamity. "Anyway," he added, waving a hand, "if it's all the same to you, I'd be happy to show you around. Can't have our guest of honor looming by the gate all night looking like death come to check the census." Ainz released a faint, amused sound, something between a breath and a rumble, subtle but unmistakably bemused. He recognized the craft in Wenzel's words, the humor, the warmth, and the buried truth. The man had spoken carefully, but not without honesty. Ainz understood and did not blame him. He nodded once more, his tone calm and sovereign. "Your hospitality is appreciated. I will not forget your kindness." And so, the village opened itself to him. But before the moment could stretch too far, before awe gave way to awkward silence, Wenzel stepped forward, raising both arms with a wide, affable grin. "All right, enough crowding the man. You'll suffocate him at this rate." A few faint chuckles rippled through the group as villagers exchanged awkward glances. Some stepped back with sheepish smiles, rubbing the backs of their necks or adjusting their cloaks. The tension eased, not gone, but gentled. Ainz let out a gravelly chuckle of his own, a strange, dry sound like old paper catching fire. "Suffocation would be quite the feat," he said, amused. "Though perhaps spiritual suffocation is still possible." Laughter rippled gently through the dispersing crowd, softening the edges of unease. Even Ainz felt a trace of something unfamiliar rise within him, lightness. His gaze settled once more on Wenzel. The poor man was struggling, his posture stiff as he tilted his head back, neck straining uncomfortably just to meet Ainz's gaze. His ever-present smile remained, but beneath it, Ainz noticed the slightest tremble in his hands. Subtle, controlled, but there. Fear, Ainz thought. Irrational, instinctive, and expected. Wenzel was doing surprisingly well to hide it. Better than anyone else so far. He seemed to struggle against the instinct to recoil from the burning lights in Ainz's eyes, but still, he held his ground. Ainz watched him for a moment longer, then chose, deliberately, to look past it. This man, Wenzel, he must have seen much to greet me with such ease. With a few more warm words and a pat to a nearby shoulder, Wenzel waved the remaining villagers off, and they obeyed without protest. Near the edge of the crowd, a small figure peeked out, Rain, clutching his mother's hand as she gently pulled him along. He glanced back, eyes bright beneath tousled hair. "Thanks, Mr. Ainz," he called out, voice high and clear. "Bye." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the warmth and bustle of the village. Wenzel gave a small nod toward the path ahead, turning with a slight hitch in his step. "Come on, then. Walk with me, mister. I'll give you a quick tour before the village decides to fall asleep on us." Ainz followed in silence, his robes whispering softly with each step. Chatter rippled through the village like wind through tall grass, full of awe and disbelief. And Ainz heard it all. His keen hearing, sharpened beyond mortal limits, caught threads of conversation even as they passed in murmurs. The voices were hushed, reverent, but constant. They spoke of the perilous journey, of the harrowing night in the forest, of how the survivors had endured, of the skeletal steeds, silent and tireless, that had carried them home, and of the figure who led them, the undead mage, Ainz Gaun. They whispered of his power, rumors of spells that shattered beasts and stilled the night, of how he moved, calm, composed, and terrifyingly still. Some claimed he could summon spirits, command the elements, and conjure objects from nothing. Others swore they had seen death itself bow to his will. There was fear in their words, yes, but also wonder, curiosity, a quiet, growing reverence. And Ainz listened. Without turning his head, without pausing his step, he absorbed it all. The village stretched before them like something drawn from a quiet dream. Cobblestone streets lined with flower boxes, wooden balconies perched above glass-paned windows, and humble stone homes crowned with soot-dark chimneys. Lanterns blinked to life one by one as dusk deepened into night, casting molten gold across the streets, pooling in corners like liquid fire. The air was thick with the scent of hearth smoke, spiced roots, fresh bread, and the faint sweetness of glaze cooling on windowsills. Ainz walked beside Wenzel through it all, silent, towering, a monument of black and bone moving gently through a world still untouched by his weight. Wenzel was diminutive beside him, his uneven steps light, his tone casual. His face bore the age of experience, cheeks weathered by sun and wind, but it was his eyes that stood out most. Or rather, the deep, countless folds where his eyes should have been. He always looked like he was content, even when his mouth remained still. Wenzel gestured as they passed a wide stone ring set into the earth, topped with a modest clay-tiled roof supported by weathered beams. A rope hung from a wooden spindle, its frayed end tied to a worn bucket resting just beside the edge. "That there's our main well, older than sin, and still draws clean water. We thank the goddess for that come spring planting." A little farther on, they entered a wider clearing at the heart of the village. "This here's the vendor plaza," Wenzel said, motioning around them. Market stalls stood shuttered for the night, their cloth coverings tied down tight, goods tucked beneath them in slumbering silence. It's not much, but come sunrise, this place comes alive. Some folks just sell right off the stone, spread a blanket, throw down what they've got. Simple things. Honest trade. Along the edges, sagging awnings and faded canvas tents clung to wooden poles, their corners weighted with stones and old tools. A few signs swayed gently in the breeze, hand-painted, faded, personal. Ainz let the silence settle for a moment, taking it in with a slow glance. Despite the worn timbers and frayed rope, something about the place felt lived in, rooted, a piece of a world that had survived by its own rhythm. "How quaint," he murmured, then turned slightly, his deep voice rising with a composed warmth. "I admit, I am rather curious. In particular, if there are any merchants who deal in magical oddities, trinkets, charms, curios with enchantment woven through them, however faint." His crimson gaze flicked toward a crooked sign painted with a sigil. "I've long had a fondness for such things. You might call me a collector, or, more honestly, a hoarder of magic artifacts. If there is even a scrap of magic clinging to some forgotten token, I tend to find it." Wenzel chuckled, the lines at his eyes creasing further as he gave Ainz a sideways glance. "A hoarder, eh? I like that. But I'll warn you now, we've got a few old charms, sure, maybe a staff or two from some hedge mage who passed through, and the odd ring said to bring luck, or maybe a touch of defensive magic, if the stories aren't just hot air." He scratched the side of his jaw, eyes narrowing with a grin that was equal parts mischief and respect. "Nothing fancy, not the sort of thing a great mage, or someone with your kingly bearing, would usually be interested in. Ainz's reply was a gravel-deep chuckle, smooth and low, echoing like stones shifting beneath the earth. Oh, I wouldn't be so certain. Standards can be adjusted when curiosity leads the way. Often, the most interesting magic lies where no one bothers to search. Wenzel grinned wide beneath his straw hat. Then you'll enjoy yourself come morning, Mr. Gown. Just be careful. Curiosity's known to empty more coin purses than thieves ever did. Ainz dipped his head faintly, regal and amused, the golden edge of his robe catching the breeze. Then I shall consider it a worthy price for discovery. They walked on, settling into a comfortable silence as the soft wind stirred the market tents around them. The hush of the sleeping plaza hung gently in the air, broken only by the creak of rope and the occasional rattle of a loose sign. That's our smith's house, Wenzel said at last, breaking the quiet with a nod in its direction up ahead. Old Ortwin lives there. Keeps the forge up front. Works long hours. Doesn't say much, but his work will speak for itself. Might be worth a look. You strike me as the sort who could find interest even in iron and ash. What Wenzel spoke of was a small, cottage-sized building fronted by a compact yard. Beside it sat a squat, brick furnace, darkened with age, dusted in ash, and still pulsing faintly with the red glow of cooling embers. Buckets of water lined one side, while boxes of raw ore and bundled scrap leaned neatly against the wall. Scorched grooves marred the stone underfoot, a record of countless blades quenched in heat and time. Nearby tables and crates, worn smooth by years of labor, stood ready for the next day's work. My collector's spirit does extend to weapons, Ainz said curtly, the glow in his socket steady. Though I must admit, I cannot wield them well. There are magical restrictions involved. He left it at that, his tone final, clipped with the precision of someone not inclined to elaborate. Wenzel gave a small nod, unfazed. Fair enough, he said simply, his voice light with understanding and no trace of prying. They walked in companionable silence for a minute, the quiet path winding between shuttered homes. The gentle rustle of trees stirred around them, branches swaying beside porches, leaves whispering just beyond fences and rooftops. Then Wenzel spoke again, a faint smile tugging at his weathered face. Rain's taken a liking to you, he said, glancing over. Can't say I've ever seen him warm to a stranger so fast, let alone one that looks like you. No offense intended. Ainz inclined his skull in a faint nod. None taken. It is most curious indeed. Wenzel let out a thoughtful hum, tapping his fingertips idly against the side of his thigh as they walked. That boy's always had one foot in the world and the other dangling over the edge. Been that way since he could crawl. Maybe that's why he doesn't flinch when he looks at you. Do you know what ails him? Ainz asked, his gaze steadying, the flame in his eyes narrowing with a flicker of sharp curiosity, tinged with something close to concern. Wenzel's steps slowed. The weight in his gait shifted, not from age, but from something heavier. His smile faded, and his head tilted slightly toward the ground. It's a dreadful thing, he murmured. Cruel in a way no blade or beast could ever be. Ainz turned to face him more directly, his tone calm, but laced with intent. Is it pathological in nature? An endemic illness, perhaps, something infectious within this region? He paused, noting the flicker of uncertainty in Wenzel's expression, and narrowed it down more plainly before the man could get confused. Is it a disease? Wenzel shook his head, the motion slow and grim. No, it is worse than that. A pause followed, heavy in the quiet between their steps. Ainz's voice dropped to a murmur, his tone lower now, thoughtful and wary. A curse, then? Wenzel gave a single nod. Aye, Joiter's flame, they named it. Sounds prettier than what it is. At the name, Ainz's posture straightened slightly. Even without knowing the details, the name alone struck him as ominous. I would like to know more, he said. Can you elaborate further? Wenzel exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. Can't give you the scholar's version. I only know what I've heard over the years, stories, bits from old folks and healers. The real knowing? That's in books and sages' heads. Not mine. He paused, his voice growing quieter. They call it one of the cruel ones. A soul sickness, some say. Hits the young, the bright ones, the loud ones. The kind that make everyone smile just by walking in the room. And that's the trick of it, see. You don't catch it early, 'cause they don't look sick. Ainz remained silent. He listened. By 6, Maybe a little earlier, you start seeing it. Tiny fevers. Tired too easy when it rains or when the moon's full. Their eyes lose a bit of color. Not much, just enough to notice if you're paying attention. But they still laugh. Still run around. Sometimes more than other kids. Like they're trying to live extra hard. He shook his head, eyes fixed ahead. They don't waste away all slow like most folk. No, they shine. Burn real bright. Not 'cause they're better. It's the soul, people say. It's burning itself to keep the joy going. Keeps the body moving like nothing's wrong. Ain't painful. Ain't loud. Just quiet. Gentle. A pause. He scratched the back of his neck again, almost as if to ground himself. Like a candle using the last bit of wax just to stay lit a little longer. He then went quiet, his wrinkled eyes lost somewhere far behind the path in front of them. Ainz let the silence settle for a moment, the sound of their footsteps and distant village voices soft around them. Cruel, he said at last, his voice low, thoughtful. Deeply cruel. Wenzel nodded slowly. Aye, world's unfair that way. Sometimes feels like the purest ones get dealt the worst hands. He scratched the back of his neck again, hesitant. It's rare. Not sure if it's a curse hanging over the village or just bad luck. Some healers say they haven't seen so many cases showing up in one place before. Ainz's gaze sharpened. How many? Wenzel took a breath. 6, maybe 7, in the last 40 years alone. Started out of nowhere. No pattern. Just, one day, a child starts shining too bright. Ainz hesitated, dreading the answer, but asked the question anyway. What happened to the others? Wenzel's voice went quiet, somber. Their flames burned out. Ainz stopped walking. The words lingered like a cold wind. He glanced down the road ahead, the faint golden glow of the village soft against the growing dusk. How old is Rain? 8, Wenzel answered. Give or take. He's close. You can see it, if you know what to look for. Ainz's voice dropped further. Has there ever been a cure? A way to stop it? Wenzel looked away. No, not once. The goddess's magic heals the body, sure. Closes wounds, clears fever. But it can't touch a soul that's already burning itself to stay warm. A heavy silence followed. Ainz said nothing. His thoughts churned behind glowing sockets. Someone so young, so vibrant, struck by something so merciless. It echoed too closely with memories he hadn't let surface in some time. He remembered the world he had left behind, where pollution-induced cancers ran unchecked, where orphaned children fell through the cracks and died on streets that no longer cared to name them. Exposure, malnutrition, no access to treatment. Most never even made it to their teens. Would my healing potions even help? He wondered. Could they cure an ailment like this? He had some exotic potions in his inventory, rare ones, powerful ones, but none were designed to treat damage to the soul. Healing flesh and bone was simple. Rebuilding a decaying soul? That was something else entirely. His mind turned to the wands. Death and resurrection could be the only true path to a cure. But if Rain's soul was too fragmented, would it even return properly? Would he come back whole, or as a hollow, a mindless undead shell? He didn't know, and that uncertainty chilled him more than death ever had. He needed to learn more about this disease, this world's magic, its curses, its limits, about everything. Ainz turned his head toward Wenzel, the motion smooth and deliberate. Do you have a library? He asked, his voice deeper now, colder than before. A repository of tomes? There was something in his tone, an edge, like frost beneath velvet. It wasn't unkind, but it carried weight, the kind that made Wenzel's brow crease slightly before he caught himself. Wanting to learn more about the soul sickness? Wenzel asked, masking his brief hesitation with a half-step forward. About it, Ainz replied, his voice still low and resonant. And magic, curses, monsters, as much information as you have. Wenzel gave a small nod, the frown fading. His expression remained somber, but there was a spark of purpose beneath it. Aye, we got a place. Not grand, mind you, but it's just round the corner. Old tomes, a few ledgers on herbs, diseases, magic. Bit of history, mostly local. Maybe some stuff about the old kingdoms. Might be some useful things tucked in there. He gave a small shrug. If not, you'd have to head to a proper city for the good volumes. Any information will help, Ainz replied. They turned the corner. The street ahead was narrow and quiet, lined with stone walls and tightly spaced houses. Street lamps glowed with soft golden light, casting long, warm shadows over cobblestones. To their right stood a squat brick building, low-roofed and unassuming. It looked older than everything else nearby. Its walls were thicker, its doorway slightly warped with age, the bricks a deeper shade than those around them. Wenzel led him toward it and gestured with a half-smile. "Here we are, our little room of knowledge." As Ainz stepped toward the door, Wenzel added, "Mind your head, eh?" Ainz glanced at the doorway, then ducked beneath it. "Sorry about that," Wenzel chuckled. "You'll be getting real familiar with low beams and tight corners in Bach. Most places weren't built with tall folk or skeletal giants in mind." Ainz inclined his head faintly. "No apology necessary. I imagine I'll adapt." He added, after a slight pause, "Your help is appreciated." There was a faint effort at humor in his tone, measured, dry, but it emerged cool and restrained, as if the weight behind his voice had not fully lifted. He stepped inside. The scent met him first. Aged paper, cracked leather, the dry earthiness of dust left undisturbed. It was strangely pleasant, calming, like walking into the past. The two torches mounted along the stone wall bathed the room in amber, their light flickering across bindings and shadows alike. It gave the archive an atmosphere difficult to name, neither sacred nor somber, but still reverent. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, humble, but clearly cared for. A stone fireplace sat along one wall, unlit but clean. A wooden table stood beside it, surrounded by mismatched chairs, their surfaces nicked and worn from years of use. A few blank pages and a half-used inkwell rested nearby, next to a dull quill. Along the far wall stood a modest bookshelf that rose to Ainz's shoulder. All of the books were aged, their spines cracked and titles faded. Some looked untouched in decades. Ainz stepped forward, his skeletal frame moving with composed grace as he approached the modest bookshelf. His gaze moved over the books. The difference in the covers stood out immediately. Some were bound in rough cloth, others in mottled leather that had faded to dull browns and yellows with time. Some bore worn ribbon markers long frayed at the end. As he extended a hand, his skeletal fingers brushed across their surfaces. He could feel the textures, the flaking edges, the slight give of old glue beneath bindings. He hunched down, lowering himself to eye level with the rows, his glowing eyes burning more intensely as his focus sharpened. Behind him, Wenzel stood quietly, arms crossed, eyes drifting from the books to the physical manifestation of death standing before him. "You can borrow any you'd like," he offered gently, voice low but casual. "Keep 'em as long as you want. Most folks around here don't open these anymore. Or you can stay here and read. Write too, if it suits you." Ainz nodded, eyes still scanning the spines of the tomes before him. "You have my thanks," he said, his tone thoughtful, half-occupied. He ran a hand slowly across the shelf again. Strangely, the text came easily to him. The language was not Japanese, yet he understood every word. He had a hard time believing they would use his tongue in this place, so he could only assume it was some magical translation effect at play. Still, it felt natural. He skimmed titles absently, opening a few and glancing at prefaces and scattered illustrations. The first selections were of lesser interest, focused on the village itself and local history. The First Winter, Stories from the Old Families. A Modest History of Bach. On the Raising of the First Bridge. Bach Before the Stone-Set Wall. Recollections from Elder Carl. Gathering in the Dew Hour. When and What to Harvest. The Lay of the Central Lands. Peoples, Places, and Powers. They were intriguing in their own way, mirrors into the soul of a place. Not what he sought tonight, but likely of interest for later. After all, in his current state, time was no longer a constraint. These humble volumes might hold quiet truths about wars, culture, religion, things worth knowing. His gaze fell to the bottom row. The air felt subtly different there. These books were cleaner, their edges firmer, as if even time had been reluctant to touch them, preserved not by care, but by some quiet reverence or unease. They sat apart, not by much, but enough to suggest they were either shunned or seldom opened. Magica Fundamentum, Lessons for the First Year. Shadows of the Gross, Things Whispered Beyond the Bramble. What Makes a Grimoire? An Introduction. The Bestiary of Yore, as remembered by old Wilhelm. The Night the Sky Burned, a record of the demon's siege. Of ill winds and hollow eyes, a record of village plagues. a practical guide to demonkind, nature, magic, and imitation. Ainz let out a low, contemplative hum, a sound that echoed faintly in the quiet room. These would do for now. The titles had stirred his interest, each whispering a promise of knowledge worth pursuing. With deliberate care, he withdrew all 7 volumes one by one, stacking them neatly in his skeletal hand. At the last moment, his fingers paused, then reached again, adding the lay of the central lands, peoples, places, and powers to the collection. The pile rose comically high, a tower of worn bindings and faded covers, but not a single book shifted or slipped, as if even gravity deferred to his presence. He rose to his full, imposing height, robes cascading around him like flowing ink. The torchlight flickered across his polished skull and bone-carved pauldrons, casting a long shadow across the far wall, still, and watching. "I would like to take these," Ainz said, his voice calm and measured. Wenzel blinked up at the stack, then at Ainz, his eyes widening just slightly at the sheer height of the collected tomes. The old man let out a soft chuckle, hands resting behind his back. "Well, I'd say you plan to spend the whole night reading," he said with a crooked smile. "Can't say I blame you." Ainz inclined his head, the books perfectly balanced in his grip. "Quite likely. I have no need for sleep." Wenzel gave a small, amused huff. "Heh, wish I could say the same. As I said, take whatever you need. For as long as you want. I am truly grateful," Ainz said, as a void opened beside him, silent and seamless, dark as the abyss. The books vanished into the magic with a flicker of arcane light. Wenzel stared. "That's some kind of storage spell?" "Yes," Ainz said simply. "It is rather useful. Scary looking, too," Wenzel muttered with a dry chuckle. "I'll likely return for more," Ainz added plainly, voice deep but courteous. "If that is acceptable." Wenzel nodded. "The door's always open." He yawned, stretching his arms before walking to the entrance and pulling it open. The cool air of night spilled in. Some homes nearby were already dark, their candles long extinguished. Others flickered faintly, light fading from curtained windows. The moon had risen high, casting pale light over the roofs and streets. "Hells," Wenzel muttered, rubbing his temple. "Didn't expect time to fly like that. Maybe we pick up the grand tour again bright and early tomorrow." Ainz gave a soft, echoing chuckle. "A wise suggestion. You must be tired. As I mentioned before, I do not sleep. And I must admit, I have noticed I seem to lose track of time altogether." "You stood there still as a statue, going through books for quite a while," Wenzel said, not unkindly. "Didn't bother me. Quiet's a blessing sometimes." He paused, then stepped outside with a nod. "Come on, then. I'll show you where you'll be staying." Ainz followed, ducking beneath the doorway once again. The village had stilled. Most homes were dim now, hushed, tucked into sleep. They walked in comfortable silence. There wasn't much left to say. Wenzel's steps had slowed with the weariness of the day, and Ainz found his attention drifting toward the books now tucked away in his inventory. Only the night remained, quiet but alive, filled with the soft chirp of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. Wenzel led them down a quieter side path toward the edge of the village, where the forest crept back toward the stone borders. "We didn't know what you'd prefer," he said, "but this one's got a good hearth and a bit of space around it." They came to a stop before a quaint stone house with a sloped straw roof, climbing vines trailing across its walls. A warm orange glow shone through the windows. Wenzel stepped forward and opened the door. "It's not a palace, but it's warm. Yours as long as you want it. Mind your head again." Ainz stepped through, bowing slightly beneath the frame. The interior was modest, yet something about it struck him. A small bed sat tucked against the far wall, its woolen blanket folded neatly at the foot, a single pillow resting atop it like an afterthought. Nearby, a round table stood at the room's center, flanked by 2 mismatched chairs, one slightly taller than the other, their legs uneven but well balanced on the stone floor. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting amber light across the walls and ceiling, its warmth chasing away the evening chill. Beside the hearth sat a simple rocking chair, its frame worn smooth by years of gentle motion. The wood bore small notches and faded carvings, faint traces of whoever had once passed the time there. It was a humble space, but not an unloved one. Everything in the home spoke of care, of time, of stories. It looked like it belonged in a storybook. It was peaceful, almost surreal. "This is generous," ainz said, his voice deep and low, with the faintest trace of feeling slipping past his usual composure. "May I offer something in return?" Wenzel waved a hand. "Bah, you already did. You brought them home." Ainz lowered his head slightly in a respectful bow. "Then I thank you." Wenzel gave a final bow of his own. "I'll let you be, Mr. Gown. Sleep's calling my name louder than I'd like to admit. It was a pleasure meeting you, Wenzel, and the villagers. I shall see you tomorrow." With a tired chuckle and a tip of his hat, Wenzel turned and stepped out into the night. The wooden door clicked shut behind him. Ainz remained still. For a long moment, he simply stood in the center of the cottage, letting the quiet wrap around him. It was a gentle silence, filled only by the faint crackle of firewood and the creak of timber beams settling in the night air. He stepped toward the window overlooking the forest. His vision pierced the darkness with ease. Beyond the trees, all was still. Far off, the death knight moved through the tree-line, silent, methodical, its armor shifting with barely a sound. It patrolled without pause, a shadow gliding through the dark, tireless and obedient. Ainz felt its presence like a distant limb, ever connected, ever watchful. It was enough. For tonight, the death knight would suffice. He let his gaze linger a moment longer, then slowly turned from the window. His hand rose to the wooden mantle above the hearth, fingers trailing along its rough grain. He imagined what might have once sat there: simple trinkets, bits of ribbon, maybe a hand-carved toy or a seasonal wreath. A faint memory surfaced, half-formed and distant. Little socks hung over fireplaces, a pine tree wrapped in colored lights. He'd seen them in books, maybe an old video shown in school. Holidays from a time before his own. Traditions that had faded long before he could ever take part in them. And yet, in this quiet cottage, bathed in firelight and stillness, he could almost feel it, like the echo of a warmth he had never truly known. Do they have such holidays here? He wondered. Seasons of joy and gathering, of warmth, shared meals, and gratitude for simply enduring together. A time for small gifts and quiet laughter, untouched by fear. He hoped so. And if such a time came, if he was permitted to return upon it, just once, he would not remain long. But a part of him, buried deep, yearned to see it. To stand at the edge of joy and remember what it once meant. The thought settled in his mind like dust in lamplight, faint and quietly glowing. Then his gaze shifted to the rocking chair by the hearth. Sturdy, hand-carved, with smooth curves worn by time. He stepped toward it, pulled it gently beside the table, and eased himself down with careful grace. The wood creaked softly beneath him as it rocked back, adjusting to his weight without protest. A place to rest, a moment to think. The fire cast long shadows across the stone floor. Its warmth touched nothing in him, but he watched it anyway, watched it move and flicker as though it held the secrets of life itself. His gaze swept the room again. A small kitchen with hooks bearing worn iron pans. A line of knives mounted neatly above a cutting board. A bundle of dried herbs tied with twine near the hearth. A chipped ceramic jar filled with spoons. On the far shelf, an oil lantern and a lopsided hand-sewn cushion. Ainz sat motionless, his frame wrapped in firelight and thought. He almost felt at home. With a slow, contemplative breath he didn't need, he lifted his hand. A void shimmered briefly beside him, and with a sound like parchment folding into reality, the book slipped from his inventory and landed softly onto the table. Plop, plop, plop. The books landed in a neat stack, their cracked spines and stained covers catching the firelight. Ancient knowledge, forgotten things, bound by hands long since turned to dust. Ainz stared at them for a moment in stillness. He reached out and took the first one. Of ill winds and hollow eyes, a record of village plagues. His fingers curled around the cover. His shoulders rose ever so slightly, then tensed. Diseases, curses, afflictions that wove through bloodlines and breath, silent and enduring. He had mastered death in Yggdrasil, bent it to his will with perfect clarity, where systems obeyed and outcomes were certain. But this was not Yggdrasil. Even within a body steeped in arcane mastery, he understood that what he believed were the principles of life and death had been shaped by structured rules, clean, ordered, and bound to the logic of a game. Controlled through menus. Predictable. Contained. But here, the edges blurred, and doubt, quiet and persistent, gnawed at the seams of his power. Could he cure the incurable? Could he defy the slow, cruel grip of fate? A quiet fear settled into the corners of his mind, not fear of death, but of limitations, of discovering, perhaps, that something remained in this world beyond his reach. He stared at the book a moment longer. Then, gently, he set it aside. Not yet. There would be enough time to scour its contents before sunrise, and most of the others too. But not now. Not while the fire crackled softly. Not while the silence in this cottage felt like something close to peace. He reached again, this time for a thinner, worn volume with delicate gilding across its title. Magica Fundamentum, Lessons for the First Year. The weight in his posture eased, just slightly. He opened the book and began to read, letting the quiet of the cottage settle around him like a heavy blanket. He wanted this serene feeling to last, even if just for a little while longer. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Like, sub, and leave a comment. Don't forget to support the writer. See you in the next video.